August 31st, 1997, at 12:23 a.m., a black Mercedes races through a Paris tunnel, with paparazzi in pursuit, with a driver who had way too much to drink, and with a woman in the back seat who just wanted to be left alone. And 10 seconds later, there was silence. And within hours, the news would reach every corner of the planet. Her name was Diana. But this isn't just a story about how she passed away. It's about how she lived and why, almost 30 years later, the world still can't let her go. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded. Today, we are talking about someone who is near and dear to billions of people's hearts, and that is Princess Diana, and specifically about the conspiracies around her death and the life that she lived before it. Diana Frances Spencer came into the world on July 1st, 1961. We share the same birthday! And she was born not into a hospital, but in a house on royal land. And that is Park House, Sandringham, leased from the Queen herself. And the Spencers had been intertwined with the crown for generations, 5 centuries of aristocracy. And descended from King Charles II, her father served as equerry to 2 monarchs. And young Diana would call Queen Elizabeth Aunt Lilibet. And she was born into privilege, but she was not born into happiness necessarily, because her parents had desperately wanted a boy. And a year earlier, they'd actually lost a son named John, who was just 10 hours old. So when Diana arrived, they were not as happy. They really wanted a boy, and they would wait an entire week to even name her, which is just so sad. And that rejection was only the beginning. And when Diana was 6 years old, her mother would fall in love with another man and leave. And what followed was a custody battle so vicious that Diana's own grandmother testified against her daughter in court, and the children stayed with their father. So her mother, kind of a piece of shit. And Diana would later tell her nanny that she used to wait on the doorstep for her mother, but she never came home. Just heartbreaking. And that abandonment carved something deep into her. And at just 9 years old, she made a vow saying, quote, "I will never marry unless I'm really in love. Because if you're not in love, you're going to get divorced. And I never intend to be divorced." You and me both, Diana. It's probably around that time when my dad was on his second marriage. And I was like, I don't think you're doing this right. And then he got divorced later on. Shout out, Dad. 2 divorces in, maybe 3 to come. We'll see. I don't know. I'm just kidding, Dad. Just kidding. But also, it's true. Anyway, but she would carry that wound everywhere through boarding school, where she failed her exams twice, but won an award for helping others, and through a miserable stint at finishing school in Switzerland. And through her short-lived dream of becoming a ballerina because she grew too tall. But eventually she would move to London, and at 18, Diana moved into a flat her mother bought her in Earl's Court, valued at around £50,000. Okay, mommy came back. mommy bought a really expensive flat for her, but that doesn't buy back love, okay? And regardless, from coming from a very wealthy family, she would work 3 days a week as a kindergarten assistant. And the other days, she was a nanny for an American family who only discovered she was an aristocrat when they found a bank slip from Coutts, the royal family's bank, marked Lady Diana Spencer. You know, it just goes to show she was very humble from the very beginning. And she just genuinely loved helping people. And she was shy, and she was kind, and she was ordinary in all the ways that mattered. And she would later call these years the happiest of her life. But she had no idea what was coming. So the first time Diana Spencer met Prince Charles, she was 16 years old, and he was 29 and dating her older sister, actually, at the time. So it was November 1997 at a shooting party at Althorpe, the Spencer family estate. And Charles was there for Sarah. And Diana was just the kid's sister, home from boarding school, lingering in the plowed fields in her wellies. But Charles would notice her, and he would later describe her as a very jolly and amusing and attractive 16-year-old. Kind of gross knowing that he's 29 years old, but we're just gonna skip past that, I guess. And Diana would notice him too. And she already had photos of the prince by her bedside, him just being a schoolgirl crush she never expected to amount to anything. But her private first impression was telling, with quote, "God, what a sad man," she would say about the first encounter later on in life with him. So 3 years would go by and the relationship with Sarah, Diana's older sister, would fizzle. And Charles drifted through a string of eligible women while the palace grew impatient. And at this point, he was 31 and the heir to the throne, and also unmarried, which ain't good in the royal family. And then came the summer of 1980, and Charles was reeling from the assassination of Lord Mountbatten, his great uncle, and his mentor, the man he called his honorary grandfather. And he was killed by an IRA bomb the year before. And at a barbecue that July, Diana found him sitting alone. And she went to him saying, quote, "You looked so sad when you walked up the aisle at the funeral," unquote, she said. Quote, "You need someone beside you," unquote. And according to Diana, that's when everything changed. Quote, "Whereupon he leapt upon me and started kissing me," unquote. And what followed was one of the shortest courtships in royal history. And Diana would later reveal the truth to biographer Andrew Morton, saying, quote, "We met 13 times and we got married," unquote. 13 times. Which I know there's other marriages that happen around the world, like arranged marriages. They never meet at all. But for this specifically for the royal family, that's kind of crazy. But she was a beautiful young woman plucked from obscurity to marry the most eligible bachelor in the world. But behind closed doors, there were warning signs from the very beginning. And the engagement was announced on February 24th, 1981, and Diana was 19. And the press gathered for the obligatory interview. The smiling couple, sparkling rings, softball questions, and then a reporter asked,
"And I suppose in love?"
And Diana answered immediately, saying, "Of course." And Charles paused. And this is where all the red flags start sticking up in the air, lit on fire. And he says,
whatever in love means.
Well, it
Put your own interpretation.
"Oh my God." And Diana's face would flicker. And she would later describe that moment as traumatic, saying, quote, "I thought, what a strange answer," unquote. But Diana's ring was a 12-carat Ceylon sapphire surrounded by 14 diamonds. And Diana had chosen it herself from a Garrard catalog. And it wasn't custom-made or one-of-a-kind by any means, but it was beautiful. But some in the palace considered it unsuitably common. "Oh, I dare think it's unsuitably common diamond." Whatever, dude. Anytime Diana could have got dunked on by the family, she got dunked on, okay? But that same ring now sits on the finger of Catherine, Princess of Wales, But even before the wedding, Diana discovered she wasn't the only woman in Charles' life. And about 2 weeks before the ceremony, she found a bracelet, gold, engraved with 2 letters, G and F. And she knew what that meant. Gladys and Fred, the pet names Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles had given each other, borrowed from a radio comedy called The Goon Show. And Diana, like any of us hearing this story, was absolutely devastated, and she confronted Charles. And she would overhear a phone call where he told Camilla, quote unquote, "Whatever happens, I will always love you." And she wanted to call off the wedding. But her sister's response was, quote, "Bad luck, duck. Your face is on the tea towels now. You're too late to chicken out," unquote. Some sisters, dude. It's all about imagery. It's all about image. And to rub dirt in the wound, the night before the wedding, Charles reportedly cried. Oh, come on, you piece of shit. So on July 29th, 1981, nearly 750 million people tuned in to watch Diana Spencer walk down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral. Allegedly, it was almost 1 billion people, which is at that point, 1/7 of the planet, which is bonkers to even fathom. But it just goes to show how many people were so excited and so loved Diana specifically. And 600,000 spectators lined the streets of London, and 74 countries broadcast the ceremony live. And it was the most watched event in television history at that point, which is a record that would hold for years. And the dress was a David and Elizabeth Emanuel creation with ivory silk taffeta, hand embroidered with 10,000 pearls and sequins, 153 yards of tulle, and a train that stretched 25 feet behind her, the longest in royal wedding history. And that dress takes the cake. Best dress in history, in my opinion. But it was so voluminous that Diana could barely fit into the carriage. And she was very nervous, obviously. And she accidentally transposed Charles' name in her vows, calling him Philip Charles Arthur George instead of Charles Philip. And the congregation chuckled warmly, but Diana did something else that day, something deliberate. And she became the first royal bride in history to omit the word obey from her vows. We love Diana for this. We absolutely love Diana for this. She's a queen. She's a queen. She's a princess, but she's a queen. And on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, they kissed and the crowd roared. A new tradition was born, and then they left for their honeymoon. So the cracks appeared almost immediately. I mean, even before, when he was crying to Camilla on the phone, the cracks were there before the wedding even happened, but especially on the honeymoon. Because aboard the royal yacht Britannia, cruising the Mediterranean, Diana expected intimacy, connection, as you do on your honeymoon, a chance to finally begin their life together. But instead, she found distance. And a few days into the voyage, photographs of Camilla fell from Charles' diary, and he was wearing gold cufflinks engraved with intertwined C's, a gift from Camilla. And he wanted to paint watercolors and read philosophy, and Diana wanted to talk, but they had nothing to say to each other. And Diana reportedly destroyed one of his paintings during a blazing argument. And she, at this time, was 19 years old, alone on a boat with a man she barely knew, surrounded by staff, but also surrounded by silence. So the fairy tale was basically immediately over. Didn't even start, really. And she just didn't know yet how bad it was going to get. But at some point, they were naturally intimate, and less than a year after the wedding, Diana was pregnant. And on June 21st, 1982, she gave birth to Prince William Arthur Philip Louis at St. Mary's Hospital in London. So it was a break from centuries of tradition, and the first direct heir to the throne ever born in a hospital rather than a palace. And it would not be her last break from tradition, which is why we love her. And when William was just 9 months old, Diana insisted on bringing him along on the royal tour of Australia and New Zealand. But no royal baby had ever accompanied their parents on an overseas visit. So, naturally, the palace resisted, but Diana refused to budge, and she won. And something remarkable happened on that trip, because the crowds didn't want Charles, they wanted her. They wanted Diana. And thousands of people lined the streets, craning for a glimpse of the young princess with the shy smile and the downcast eyes. And when Charles worked one side of the street and Diana the other, the side that got Charles audibly groaned with disappointment, which is awesome. But quote-unquote, Diana mania had begun, and she was 21 years old at this time, and she was already the most famous woman in the world. So 2 years later, on September 15th, 1984, Prince Harry was born, and Diana had hoped a second child might bring her closer to Charles, but instead, it drove them further apart. And Charles had wanted a girl, so when Harry arrived, red-haired and Spencer through and through, his reported reaction cut Diana deeply, saying, quote-unquote, "Oh God, it's a boy, and he's even got red hair." Shut the fuck up, you piece of shit. Diana would later say that moment was, quote, "the beginning of the end," unquote, of their marriage. But if her marriage was failing, her motherhood was absolutely not, because Diana didn't raise her children the way royals were supposed to. She refused to wear hats to public events. "You can't cuddle a child in a hat," she explained. And she took William and Harry to McDonald's, to Disney World, to homeless shelters and AIDS clinics. And she let them wear jeans and baseball caps, and she raced them to the car on the school run, and she sent William to a normal school, the first heir to the throne in history not educated privately at home. And when the palace suggested the boys be named Albert and Arthur, Diana overruled them, saying, "Too old," she said. Just literally a queen. She's the queen of standing on business. You do not f with mommy Diana, okay? because she wanted her sons to understand the world beyond palace walls, and she wanted them to know that not everyone lived the way they did. Quote, I want them to have an understanding of people's emotions, people's insecurities, people's distress, and people's hopes and dreams, unquote. She was preparing them for something, and perhaps she didn't yet know what. So while Diana was redefining royal motherhood, her public image was reaching extraordinary heights, and the shy die of early engagements had evolved into something else entirely. A global fashion icon, a magazine cover fixture, and the most photographed person on the planet. And she collaborated with designers like Catherine Walker and Versace, and every outfit made headlines, and every hairstyle was copied. But the fascination went beyond fashion. There was something about Diana, just a warmth, a vulnerability, an openness that felt different from every royal who had come before. Because she made eye contact, and she touched people, and she listened, and the public just adored her for that. Meanwhile, the palace didn't know what to do with her. And Charles just grew to resent her even more. And by 1986, the marriage had collapsed, and Charles would later admit it had irretrievably broken down by that year. And the cause wasn't mysterious. It had a name, and that name was Camilla Parker Bowles. Because Charles had never stopped loving her, even having 2 beautiful children with Diana and just going through the motions. He never really truly loved Diana. He was always in love with Camilla, even during their honeymoon. And now, with Diana consumed by motherhood and public duties, he returned to Camilla fully. And Diana knew. Of course, she knew. And in 1989, at a party, she confronted Camilla directly, and the details of that conversation have never been fully disclosed, but Diana would later summarize the state of her marriage with devastating clarity, saying, quote,
well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
God, that interview was so iconic, and I'm so proud of her for that. But what the public didn't see, and what almost no one saw, was what was happening behind closed doors. Because Diana's bulimia began the week after she got engaged. Because Charles, again, stupidly, made a comment about her waist being a bit chubby. And it triggered something. And between her engagement and her wedding, Diana's waist shrank from 29 inches to 23.5 inches. So she was disappearing, and no one in the palace seemed to notice, or I think just cared. And she would say, quote, I was crying out for help, but giving the wrong signals. But she binged, and she purged, and she hurt herself, and she cut her wrists and her chest. And she would even throw herself down a staircase while 4 months pregnant with William, saying, quote, I just needed time to adjust to my new position, unquote. But time wasn't something anyone gave her. And the institution was supposed to support her and had no idea how to handle a young woman in a crisis, so they just ignored it, or they blamed her, and the whispers inside the palace painted her as unstable and difficult and hysterical. So Diana was just drowning, and she was completely alone. So by the early 1990s, the war between Charles and Diana had spilled into public view, and both camps fed stories to sympathetic journalists, and both sides fought for control of the narrative. And the tabloids gorged on every leak and every rumor and every sideways glance. And then the tapes came. And in August of 1992, The Sun published transcripts of an intimate phone conversation between Diana and a man named James Gilby. And he called her Squidgy 53 times. So the press dubbed it Squidgygate. And Diana, naturally, was humiliated. But she didn't have to wait long for Charles' turn. And shortly after, transcripts emerged of a phone call between Charles and Camilla, which was explicit and graphic and mortifying, and Charles mused about being reincarnated as a tampon. So Camillagate made Squidgygate look extremely tame. So I'm not saying, Diana's innocent in all this necessarily. There was claims of that too. But I mean, from the get-go, this guy and the whole family was just treating her like a piece of shit. So she just needed someone to talk to. So I am taking sides. But at this time, the monarchy was eating itself alive. And then came the book. And in June of 1992, Andrew Morton published Diana, Her True Story. And it was a bombshell, detailing her bulimia, her isolation, her husband's affair, her you-know-what attempts. And the palace was blindsided and the public was stunned. And what no one knew at the time was that Diana herself was the source, because she had secretly recorded hours of tapes and passed them to Morton through an intermediary. And the book was her testimony delivered while she was still trapped inside the institution. And it was, in many ways, the first shot in her war for independence. And there was one more secret Diana revealed, though this one would come later in her own voice. And his name was James Hewitt, a cavalry officer. Handsome, attentive, everything Charles was not, basically. And their affair lasted 5 years from 1986 to 1991. And Diana would eventually admit to it publicly in her 1995 Panorama interview, saying, "Yes, I adored him. Yes, I was in love with him. But I was very let down." And Hewitt sold his story for £300,000. And Diana learned once again that trust was a luxury she could not afford. And by the end of 1992, the marriage was over in all but name. And on December 9th, Prime Minister John Major stood in the House of Commons and read a statement from Buckingham Palace, saying, quote, "With regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate," unquote. So the fairy tale was officially dead, although I think it was dead before it even started. But Diana's story was far from over. In fact, the most important chapter was just beginning. So while her marriage was crumbling, Diana found something that gave her life meaning, because she had always been expected to do charity work, and it came with the title: shake hands, cut ribbons, smile for the cameras, and move on. But Diana didn't do charity the way royals were supposed to, because she refused to wear gloves. And it sounds like a small thing, but it wasn't, because for generations, members of the royal family had kept a barrier between themselves and the public, which was literal and symbolic, specifically white gloves with formal distance and a nod instead of a touch. But Diana stripped all that away because she wanted to feel the hands she held, and she wanted people to feel hers, saying, quote, "I led from the heart, not the head. And albeit that's got me into trouble in my work, I understand that," unquote. And it would get her into more than trouble. It would change the world. Because on April 9th, 1987, London Middlesex Hospital, Britain's first dedicated AIDS unit, was opening, and Princess Diana was there to cut the ribbon. And at the time, the disease was barely understood and widely feared, and probably around half of the British public believed that AIDS patients should be quarantined, because people thought you could catch it from a handshake, from a toilet seat, from just breathing the same air. So the stigma was suffocating, and patients were dying alone and untouched and abandoned by their own families. But Diana walked into that ward and did something no one expected. She shook a patient's hand. No gloves, no hesitation, and she didn't let go. And it was 6 weeks before Ronald Reagan would even say the word AIDS in public. So it was one photograph and one gesture, and suddenly the most famous woman in the world was telling everyone watching, these people are not dangerous, they are not untouchable, they are human beings. And Diana would return to AIDS wards again and again over the following decade, and she held patients, and she hugged them, and she sat on their beds and listened to their stories. Quote, "HIV does not make people dangerous to know," unquote, she declared at a 1991 conference. Quote, "You can shake their hand and give them a hug. Heaven knows they need it," unquote. And one patient recalled the impact of her visit, saying, quote, "The princess shook my hand without wearing a glove, and that meant more to me than anything," unquote. And Andrew Morton would later write that Diana had, quote, "done more than anyone alive to remove the stigma surrounding the deadly AIDS virus," unquote. And she didn't do it with policy, she didn't do it with speeches, she did it with her hands. But Diana wasn't content to challenge stigma from the safety of hospital wards. And in January of 1997, she traveled to Angola, a country ravaged by decades of civil war and littered with landmines, millions of them, buried in fields and roads and schoolyards, and every month hundreds of civilians were killed or maimed, and many of them children. And the images from that trip became iconic, because Diana, dressed in body armor and a protective visor, walking slowly through an active minefield in Huambo. and one wrong step could have killed her, but she didn't flinch. And at one point, she detonated a practice mine, and the explosion echoed across the field, and Diana reportedly turned to her companions and said, "One down, 17 million to go." I can't, she's just, literally, I don't know how many times I can say she's a queen, but what the hell? She's a saint. I mean, nobody's perfect. Obviously, she's not perfect. Nobody's perfect, but my goodness, I mean, she's a good person. We can all say that. But the British government, at this point, was furious, and a junior minister called her a loose cannon, and politicians accused her of meddling in foreign policy, of being naive, of not understanding the complexities of international arms agreements. But Diana didn't give a shit, and she said,
Because I'm not a political figure, I am a humanitarian figure, and always have been, and always will be.
And she returned to the cause again and again. And in August of 1997, just 23 days before her death, she visited Bosnia, walking through the ruins of a war-torn Sarajevo, meeting survivors and holding their hands. And at a speech in June of that year, she called landmines, quote-unquote, the plague on Earth. And 3 months after she died, 122 countries signed the Ottawa Treaty, banning anti-personnel landmines forever. So Diana didn't live to see it, but she did make it happen. But what made Diana different wasn't just what she did, it was how she did it. She didn't visit hospitals for photo opportunities. She visited hospitals because she wanted to be there, and she would stay much longer than scheduled, and she came back when the cameras weren't watching, and she wrote letters, and she made phone calls, and she remembered names, and she would sit with the dying, and she held babies with HIV, and she embraced lepers in Indonesia when others refused to go near them, and she visited homeless shelters not as a princess, but as a person who genuinely wanted to understand, saying, quote, "Nothing brings me more happiness than trying to help the most vulnerable people in society. It is a goal and an essential part of my life, a kind of destiny," unquote. And then she added something that revealed everything about who she was, saying, quote, "Whoever is in distress can call on me. I will come running wherever they are," unquote. And she meant it. And that was the thing about Diana. The compassion wasn't performed, it was real. And people could feel it, and the sick, and the suffering, and the forgotten. They looked into her eyes and saw someone who actually cared. And Stephen Lee, director of the UK Institute of Charity Fundraising Managers, said it plainly, saying, quote, "Her overall effect on charity is probably more significant than any other person's in the 20th century," unquote. Because she wasn't trained for this. She had no background in public health or international relations. She had failed her O-levels twice, in fact, but she had something else, and that is something no amount of education can provide. Quote, "I'd like to be a queen in people's hearts, but I don't see myself being queen of this country," unquote. And she was right on both accounts. So on December 9th, 1992, when Prime Minister John Major rose in the House of Commons to deliver the statement to the Buckingham Palace that the Prince and Princess of Wales decided to separate, as we said before, the fairy tale was over. And it had been, by any measure, the worst year in modern royal history. And the Queen herself called it an annus horribilis. And Andrew Morton's book had exposed the rot at the heart of the marriage. And Squidgygate and Camillagate had humiliated both parties, and a disastrous joint tour to South Korea, where Charles and Diana could barely look at each other, had earned them the nickname the Glums. And the separation was inevitable, but it wasn't a divorce, not yet. And Diana remained Princess of Wales, and she kept her apartments at Kensington Palace, and she was still technically part of the family, but she was no longer silent. So on November 20th, 1995, 23 million people in Britain tuned into BBC's Panorama, and another 200 million watched around the world. And Diana sat across from journalist Martin Bashir in Kensington Palace, and she was calm, and she was composed, and utterly devastating. And for nearly an hour, she laid bare the truth of her marriage, and the affairs, and the isolation, and the eating disorder, and the palace that had failed her. And she would speak of Charles' relationship with Camilla without bitterness, but without mercy either. And she admitted to her own affair with James Hewitt, like we spoke about before. And she described her bulimia and her self-harm. and her desperate cries for help that weren't answered. But this whole interview was a declaration of independence, and it was a direct challenge to the monarchy itself, and she went further. And when asked whether Charles was fit to be king, she hesitated just long enough. And she said, quote, "There was always conflict on that subject with him because of the position I was seen to be in," unquote. And the message was unmistakable. Diana was no longer playing by palace rules, and the royal family was furious. And the Queen, after consulting with the Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury, took an unprecedented step. And she wrote to both Charles and Diana insisting that they divorce, because Diana had forced their hand, and she had done it on her own terms. But in 2020, a BBC graphic designer named Matt Weissler came forward with a stunning revelation, because he had been asked to forge bank statements, fake documents suggesting that Diana's staff were being paid by the security services to spy on her. And Martin Bashir had used those forgeries to win Diana's trust. And he had fed her paranoia and manipulated her fears and convinced her brother Earl Spencer to make the introduction. So the entire interview, the one that changed everything, had been obtained through deception. And an independent investigation led by Lord Dyson confirmed it all. And Bashir was, quote, "unreliable, devious, and dishonest," unquote. And the BBC had covered it up for years. And Prince William's response was devastating, saying, quote, "It brings indescribable sadness to know that the BBC's failures contributed significantly to her fear, paranoia, and isolation that I remember from those final years with her," unquote. Because the interview, like I said before, had been Diana's declaration of independence, but it also had been a trap, one that deepened her mistrust of everyone around her and accelerated her spiral into isolation, and she would never know that truth. So the divorce was finalized on August 28, 1996. Diana received £17 million and $400,000 annually for her private office. And like I said before, she kept her apartments at Kensington Palace, and she retained access to the royal jets. And she would remain Princess of Wales. But she would lose something as well, because at Charles' insistence, she was stripped of the title Her Royal Highness. Basically, it was just petty cruelty on his part, just a final twist of the knife. And Diana would now have to curtsy to her own children. And when Prince William learned of it, he tried to confront her, saying, quote, "I don't care what you're called. You're still mummy," unquote. And then he made her a promise, saying, quote, "When I'm king, I'll give it back to you," unquote, which makes me want to cry. But after the divorce, Diana stepped back from public life, at least partially, and she resigned from over 100 charities, choosing to focus her energy on just 6 causes close to her heart: the Centrepoint, the English National Ballet, Great Ormond Street Hospital, the Leprosy Mission, and the National AIDS Trust, and the Royal Marsden Hospital. So she was no longer trying to be everything to everyone. She was trying to figure out who she was, outside of the palace and outside of the title and outside of the spotlight. And for a while, there was a man, Dr. Hasnat Khan, a Pakistani heart surgeon, and they met at the Royal Brompton Hospital in 1995. And by all accounts, Diana was deeply in love with him, and she called him Mr. Wonderful, and she visited his family in Pakistan, and she dreamed of a life away from it all, with a quiet existence far from cameras and tabloids. But Khan couldn't handle the pressure and the scrutiny and the impossibility of a private life with the most famous woman in the world. And by the summer of 1997, it was over, and Diana was alone again. So by the summer of 1997, Diana was 36 years old. And she was free, and she was searching, and she was about to meet a man named Dadi Fayed. And his father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, was an Egyptian billionaire, owner of Harrods department store and the Ritz Paris. And he had cultivated a relationship with Diana for years, inviting her and the boys to his estate in Surrey, offering his yacht for holidays. And in July of 1997, Diana accepted an invitation to join the Al-Fayed family in Saint-Tropez. And she brought William and Harry, and they cruised the Mediterranean on the Jonakal, a 200-foot super yacht. And for a few days, they were just a mother and her sons, swimming and laughing under the summer sun. And Harry would later call it heaven. And then Dottie arrived. He was 42 and a film producer, and he was also handsome and attentive. and charming in the way that men with unlimited resources can be charming. And he showered Diana with gifts, with attention, with the one thing she had always craved, just the whole sense that someone was actually choosing her. And by August 10th, the photographers had captured them kissing on the yacht, and the photo went around the world, and the tabloids erupted because there was a new romance, a new scandal. So the questions came fast. Was it serious? Would she marry him? What would it mean for the boys? And Diana, for once, didn't seem to care what anyone thought, because she was happy, or something close to it at least, that she had no way of knowing that she had less than 3 weeks to live. So the last 10 days of Diana's life were mostly spent on the water, and she and Dottie cruised the Mediterranean aboard the Janakal, drifting between Sardinia and the French coast. And the crew described her as relaxed, lighter than they'd ever seen her, and she listened to George Michael's older album on repeat. And she laughed easily, and she slept late, and for the first time in years, she seemed at peace. And on or around August 26th, they made a stop into Monaco, and Dottie took her to Reposi, an exclusive jeweler near the harbor, and they looked at rings, in one collection in particular, and it was called Dis-moi oui, Tell Me Yes. And the ring Diana chose was worth approximately $200,000. It's a nice ring. And whether it was an engagement ring, a promise, or simply a gift, no one knows for certain, because Diana never got the chance to tell anyone. So Saturday, August 30th, 1997, in the late morning, Diana and Dottie left Sardinia aboard the Al Fayed family's private jet, a Harrods Gulfstream 1V, and their destination was Paris. And it was to be a brief stopover before returning back to London. And they landed at the Le Bourget airport at 3:20 in the afternoon. And the paparazzi were already waiting, of course, because they're assholes. And 4 motorcycles idled in the parking lot, cameras ready, engines running. And the hunt had begun before Diana even stepped off the plane. And from the airport, a chauffeured Mercedes took them into the city, and the first stop was the Villa Windsor, the former home of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, the king who abdicated for the woman he loved. And Mohammed Al Fayed had recently leased it and was renovating it as a potential residence for Dottie and Diana. But they wouldn't stay for long, and Diana reportedly found it gloomy and oppressive. So by late afternoon, they arrived at the Ritz Paris, another Al Fayed property, and they entered through the rear, avoiding the growing crowds of photographers at the front. And once inside, Diana made a phone call, and she rang Balmoral to speak with William and Harry, but this would be the last time she would ever hear their voices. And that evening began to unravel almost immediately, as Dottie had planned a romantic dinner at Chez Bonnois, a quiet bistro in the first arrondissement. But when they arrived, a mob of paparazzi were already there, cameras pressed against the windows, flashbulbs popping and voices shouting. So they turned around without getting out of the car. So another attempt at privacy, but this time at the hotel's 2 Michelin star restaurant, Les Padans. Sorry if I'm saying these wrong, by the way. But word would spread, and within minutes, other diners were staring, and phones were ringing, and the sanctuary had been breached. So Diana and Dottie abandoned their meal and retreated upstairs to the Imperial Suite. And CCTV footage from that evening shows Diana walking through the lobby with her eyes downcast and her expression tired and distressed. And she just looks like a woman who just wanted to disappear. Meanwhile, a man named Henry Paul was making his way back to the hotel. And Paul was the 41-year-old deputy head of security at the Ritz, and he hadn't been scheduled to work that night, and his shift had ended hours earlier, but he was called back when it became clear that Diana and Dottie would need an escort. So he arrived at 10:08 p.m., and colleagues who saw him later said he seemed fine and sober and professional, but something had happened during the 3 hours he'd been off duty, and where Henry Paul went between 7 to 10 p.m. that night has never been fully explained. And investigators would later find evidence that he'd consumed at least 2 Ricards, a strong anise-flavored aperitif at the hotel bar. But even that didn't account for what they would find in his blood later on. And he was also allegedly taking a dangerous cocktail of medications at the time, Prozac for depression and Thiopride, a drug used to treat alcoholism, and a sleeping pill called Noctamid. And all 3 carried warnings against driving, and all 3 had their effects magnified by alcohol. So Henry Paul should not have been behind the wheel of a car that night. But no one knew, or if they did, no one stopped him. So just after midnight, a plan was hatched. Dottie was fed up, and the paparazzi had made the evening completely impossible, and he wanted to get Diana back to his apartment near the Arc de Triomphe without being followed. So they devised a decoy, and Dottie's regular Mercedes and his usual driver would pull up to the front entrance of the Ritz, creating a diversion. The photographers would follow. Meanwhile, a second car, a rented black Mercedes S280, would slip out the back with Diana and Dottie inside, and Henry Paul would drive. And Trevor Rees-Jones, Dottie's bodyguard, would ride in the front passenger seat. And no backup vehicle, no police escort, no other security, just the four of them. So at 12:20 a.m., they made their move, and Henry Paul led them through the rear exit onto Rue Cambon. And as they climbed into the Mercedes, he reportedly turned to the photographers gathered nearby and called out, "Don't try to follow, you'll never catch us." Then he floored it, which is extremely odd. Given they had already created this diversion, why would he draw attention? It doesn't make sense. And the route Henry Paul chose was unconventional, because instead of taking the well-lit Champs-Élysées, the direct path to Dottie's apartment, he veered toward the Seine embankment. A faster route, yes, but also darker and more isolated, and it required passing through a tunnel, the Pont de l'Allemand underpass, which was 660 feet long, 2 lanes, and had a gentle curve, and a row of unforgiving concrete pillars down the center. And behind them, at least 6 paparazzi vehicles gave chase, motorcycles and cars weaving through traffic, desperate to get the shot. And at the Place de la Concorde, the Mercedes ran a red light, and witnesses described the car as already unstable, fishtailing, accelerating wildly, and the driver seemingly not in control at all. And the speed limit in the tunnel was 30 miles per hour, and Henry Paul was doing at least 65, and some estimates put it even higher. And the clock read 12:23 a.m. at this point. And apparently, no one inside the car was wearing a seatbelt. So the Mercedes entered the Pont de l'Allemand tunnel at twice the legal speed, and inside, 4 people, and none of them buckled in, and Henry Paul gripped the wheel, weaving through the dim orange light. And Trevor Rees-Jones sat rigid in the passenger seat, and in the back, Diana and Dottie, finally alone, finally escaping. And behind them, the paparazzi were falling back, so the decoy seemingly had worked, and the Ritz was receding in the rearview mirror. And for a moment, it must have felt like freedom. And then Henry Paul saw the car, a white Fiat Uno, puttering along in the right lane at maybe 30 miles an hour. And a dog in the back seat, and a driver who had no idea what was barreling toward him. And then Paul swerved to avoid it, and the Mercedes clipped the Fiat's rear bumper, a glancing blow just enough to destabilize the car, and paint scraped against paint, and the Fiat wobbled and kept going, but the Mercedes did not. And Paul overcorrected, and the car lurched left, and the rear tires lost grip. And allegedly 62 feet of rubber scorched into the concrete as the Mercedes began to slide. And he tried to correct again, but it was too late, and they were going way too fast. And a second skid mark, allegedly around 105 feet, carved a diagonal line across the tunnel floor, straight toward the 13th pillar. And the impact was catastrophic. And the Mercedes struck the pillar head-on at somewhere between 60 and 70 miles per hour, and the front of the car crumpled instantly, folding inward like aluminum foil. And the force was so violent that it left a perfect imprint, a cookie-cutter outline of the vehicle stamped into the concrete. And the car didn't stop, and it would spin counterclockwise, a half rotation, then slammed backward into the tunnel wall with a second sickening crash. And when it finally came to rest, the Mercedes was facing the wrong direction, east instead of west, and smoke rose from the wreckage, and glass glittered across the roadway, and then there was silence. And Henry Paul died on impact, and allegedly his spinal column snapped and his aorta ruptured, and he was gone before he could register what had happened, and the steering wheel had crushed his chest. And at the time, he was 41 years old. And Dadi Fayed also died on impact, because the force of the collision threw him forward into the back of the front seats, and he would sustain massive internal injuries. And he would be 42 years old at the time of his death. But Trevor Rees-Jones somehow survived because the airbags saved him just barely. But essentially, every bone in his face was shattered and his jaw was dislocated, and his tongue had been forced back into his throat, and he would require 10 hours of reconstructive surgery and over 150 pieces of titanium to rebuild his skull. And he has no memory at all of the crash, apparently. And he was told he never would. And then there is Diana. She had been sitting behind Henry Paul, and when the car struck the pillar, she was thrown forward hard, and her chest slammed into the back of the front seat, and she slid down onto the floor of the Mercedes, wedged between the seats, with her legs crumpled beneath her. And when first responders got there, she was still alive. But inside her chest, something had torn, and the impact had done catastrophic damage. And her heart had been displaced, knocked to the right side of her chest, and her left pulmonary vein, the vessel that carries blood from the lungs to her heart, had been ripped at the point where it connected to the atrium. So she was bleeding internally and massively. So with every beat of her heart, blood would pour into her chest cavity instead of circulating through her body. And it would be a very rare injury, but almost always fatal. But not immediately. So Diana was barely but still conscious, slumped on the floor of the ruined Mercedes, just gasping for air. So Dr. Frederick Maliez was driving home from a party, and he was an off-duty emergency physician just passing through the tunnel on the way back to his apartment. And he saw the wreck and pulled over and ran toward the smoking car. And he had no idea who was inside, but what he found was absolute carnage. It was 4 people, 2 of them clearly dead, and a man in the front seat with catastrophic facial injuries, somehow still breathing, and in the back, a woman. And she was on her knees on the floor of the car, barely conscious, but still breathing. And Maliez reached in, trying to stabilize her airway, and he spoke to her softly, trying to keep her calm. And her murmured words, the last coherent words anyone would ever hear her say, was, "Oh my God, what's happened?" And Maliez didn't recognize her because her face was obscured by hair and blood, and he thought she was perhaps a model because she was so tall and so striking even in this state. And it wasn't until the ambulance arrived that someone told him, "That's Princess Diana." So the emergency call came at 12:26 a.m. and 3 minutes after the impact, and police would arrive at 12:30. And the first ambulance, a SAMU unit, France's Mobile Emergency Service, reached the scene at 12:40. And unlike American or British paramedics, French emergency teams include a physician. Their protocol is different. It's to stabilize on the scene before transport. Treat first, move second. And it would take an hour before Diana left the tunnel. So at approximately 1 a.m., emergency workers finally extracted her from the wreckage. And as they lifted her onto a stretcher, her heart stopped, and she would go into cardiac arrest. And the medical team shocked her and performed CPR and pumped her chest in the back of an ambulance parked in the middle of the Paris tunnel. And her heart would start again. And at 1:18 a.m., she was loaded into the ambulance, and at 1:41 a.m., more than an hour after the crash, the ambulance finally began moving toward Petit-Salpêtrière Hospital. And it was only 4 miles away, but the journey took 25 minutes. And that was because they had to stop to treat Diana. The ambulance moved slowly and sometimes stopping entirely so the doctor inside could continue working. And the thinking was that a patient in Diana's condition couldn't survive a high-speed transport, and it was better to stabilize and better to keep the heart beating. So whether a faster transport could have saved her remains one of the most debated questions of the entire tragedy. And some doctors believe she might have survived if she'd reached the operating table sooner, the so-called golden hour of trauma care. But others say the injury was simply too severe, that a torn pulmonary vein combined with a displaced heart was unsurvivable no matter what. But we will never know for certain. So the ambulance would arrive at the hospital at 2:06 a.m., 1 hour and 43 minutes after the crash. and Diana was rushed into surgery, and Dr. Alain Pavie, one of France's foremost cardiac surgeons, led the team, and they opened her chest, and they found the tear in the pulmonary vein, and they sutured it. But the damage was too great, and she had lost too much blood, and her heart had been struggling for too long. And the team would try everything: external cardiac massage, internal cardiac massage, hands physically squeezing her heart, electric shocks, adrenaline injected directly into the cardiac muscle, and for 2 hours they fought to bring her back. But at 4 a.m., they stopped, and Diana, Princess of Wales, was pronounced dead. And she was 36 years old. So back at Balmoral Castle, the phone rang in the darkness, and Prince Charles was woken by the Queen's deputy private secretary, and he was told the news, and he sat in silence for a long moment. And then he walked down the hall to wake his sons. And William was 15, and Harry was 12. And Harry would later write about the moment in his memoir, how he lay in bed waiting, and how his father sat on the edge of the mattress, and how he expected or needed to hear that Mummy was hurt, but she was going to be okay, saying, quote, "I remember waiting patiently for Pa to confirm that indeed Mummy was all right, and I remember him not doing that," unquote. And Charles told them their mother was dead, and he didn't hug them. He didn't know how. Then he left the room. And Harry didn't cry, not at that moment, and he wouldn't cry for years, allegedly, because he was only 12 years old. He didn't realize the impact of the entire situation. How would any 12-year-old? But soon he would find that nothing would ever be the same. But before Diana even had her funeral, the questions began. And those were, how did this happen and who was responsible? And the question that would haunt the next decade was this really an accident? And 3 separate investigations would attempt to answer those questions: French, British, and official, each one more exhaustive than the last. And together, they would interview over 1,000 witnesses, examine tens of thousands of documents, and spend tens of millions of dollars, and still, for some, the answers would never be enough. So the crash itself, as we know, happened on French soil, with French jurisdiction and French investigation, and Judge Hervé Stéphane was assigned to lead the inquiry, and it would consume nearly 2 years of his life, and 18 months of forensic analysis, witness interviews, and painstaking reconstruction of the final minutes of Diana's life. And his team interviewed over 1,000 witnesses, and they examined the wreckage of the Mercedes down to the molecular level. And they analyzed every frame of CCTV footage from the Ritz, and they traced Henry Paul's movements, his finances, his medical history, and what they found was damning. Because the toxicology report was unambiguous, and Henry Paul's blood alcohol level at the time of the crash was between 175 and 187 milligrams per 100 millimeters of blood. And the legal limit in France was 50. So he was nearly 4 times over the limit, the equivalent of roughly 10 drinks. But it wasn't just alcohol. His blood also contained traces of fluoxetine, the active ingredient in Prozac, and tirapride, a drug prescribed specifically to treat chronic alcoholism, the drugs that we talked about before that he was taking. And trace amounts of sleeping medication. And all 3 drugs carried explicit warnings against operating vehicles, and all 3 had their effects dramatically amplified by alcohol. So Henry Paul wasn't just drunk, he was impaired on multiple levels, and with his reflexes dulled and his judgment compromised, his ability to control a vehicle at high speed fundamentally degraded. So the question that haunted investigators was, how did no one notice? And colleagues at the Ritz who saw him that night insisted he seemed fine and sober and professional. And the CCTV footage showed him tying his shoelaces and chatting with staff, walking steadily, not stumbling and not slurring, but the blood doesn't lie. Either Henry Paul had developed such a tolerance to alcohol that he could mask severe intoxication, a hallmark of chronic alcoholism, or something else was going on. And his family would later challenge the results, and they demanded independent testing, and they suggested the blood samples had been contaminated or switched, and DNA analysis eventually confirmed the samples were, in fact, authentic, and the blood belonged to Henry Paul. So French investigators also examined the role of the paparazzi, because at least 7 vehicles had pursued the Mercedes through the streets of Paris that night. They were photographers on motorcycles and cars just desperate for the photograph that would make their careers. and some had followed at dangerously close range, and others had used blocking techniques, pulling alongside or in front of the Mercedes to slow it down for better shots. And 9 photographers were initially charged with manslaughter and failure to render assistance. But as the investigation progressed, prosecutors grew less certain. An analysis of the crash site showed that by the time the Mercedes entered the Pont de l'Allemand tunnel, the pursuing vehicles were some distance behind. So they hadn't caused the crash directly, and Henry Paul's speed and intoxication had done that. The paparazzi were part of the story, though, because they had contributed to the atmosphere of pursuit and the desperation to escape. But they hadn't physically forced the Mercedes into the pillar necessarily. But they also didn't help at all when they did crash, because they did catch up and there was no assistance. In fact, a lot of them just took photos while there were people dying in the car. Just absolute scum of the earth. So in September of 1999, all manslaughter charges were dropped, unfortunately. But 3 photographers were later convicted of lesser charges, which was invasion of privacy for photographing the dying victims at the crash scene, and their punishment was a fine of 1 symbolic euro each. I have no words for that. That makes me furious. So Judge Stefan's final report ran hundreds of pages, and his conclusion was unambiguous. The crash was an accident caused by a driver who was intoxicated, overmedicated, and traveling at a reckless speed on a difficult stretch of road while attempting to evade a slower vehicle. And Henry Paul was solely responsible. Case closed. But for many, the case was just beginning. So for 7 years after Diana's death, conspiracy theories festered, and the loudest voice belonged to Mohammed Al-Fayed, because the Harrods owner had lost his eldest son in the tunnel, and his grief was bottomless and his rage was incandescent. And he refused to accept that Dottie's death and Diana's was simply a tragic accident. And he believed they had been murdered. And Al-Fayed's theory was elaborate, inflammatory, and consistent. And British intelligence services acting on orders from highest levels of the establishment, specifically Prince Philip, had assassinated Diana and Dottie to prevent their relationship from progressing. This is the theory, by the way. I'm not stating this. This is his theory. But why would Prince Philip do this? Because, this is Mohammed saying this, Diana was pregnant with Dottie's child. Again, this is Mohammed's theory. And because they were planning to announce their engagement, and because the British establishment could not tolerate the idea that the mother of the future king might marry a Muslim, might have a half-Muslim sibling for William and Harry, and might spend her life with an Egyptian family that the royals considered beneath them. And Al-Fayed did not whisper these accusations. He shouted them to the press, to Parliament, to anyone who would listen. And he spent millions funding private investigations, and he commissioned documentaries, and he hired lawyers across multiple continents, and eventually the pressure became impossible to ignore. So in January of 2004, Sir John Stevens, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Britain's most senior law enforcement officer, was asked to investigate, and the inquiry was codenamed Operation Paget, and its scope was unprecedented. And Stevens assembled a team of 14 officers, and over nearly 3 years, they investigated 175 separate conspiracy claims, and they interviewed over 300 witnesses, including, remarkably, Prince Charles and Prince William, and they obtained what Stevens described as unprecedented access to the files of MI5 and MI6, which is Britain's domestic and foreign intelligence services. So they dug deep. And they examined Diana's medical records and her financial records and her phone records. And they analyzed Henry Paul's bank accounts, his contacts, and his possible intelligence connections. And they reviewed every frame of CCTV footage, every autopsy photograph, and every fragment of forensic evidence. And the investigation cost £8 million. And the final report ran 832 pages, supported by over 11,000 pages of additional documentation. So Operation Paget systematically demolished the conspiracy theories. And on MI6 involvement, investigators obtained complete access to intelligence service files, and they found no evidence of any operation targeting Diana, Dottie, or Henry Paul. And there was no surveillance and no assassination planning. Nothing. And anonymous senior MI6 officers testified under oath that the agency had maintained no file on Diana or Dottie, and they had no operational interest in the couple either. And the suggestion that they would murder a member of the royal family, even an ex-member, was, in their words, inconceivable. And on Prince Philip's alleged involvement, Al-Fayed had accused Prince Philip personally of ordering the assassination, which is a pretty big accusation. And Stevens found not one shred of evidence to support this claim. And Diana's relationship with the royal family was complicated, yes, but she remained the mother of the future king, and murdering her would have been catastrophically counterproductive, destroying the monarchy rather than protecting it. And on Henry Paul as an intelligence agent, this theory had some traction because of the unexplained money, because Henry Paul's bank accounts contained approximately 1.2 million francs, roughly $200,000, despite a salary of only about $35,000 per year. What the f? So where had that all come from? Well, investigators traced the deposits meticulously, and they found that Paul had received payments from various sources over the years, including possibly modest sums for providing information to French intelligence services. But there was no evidence he worked for MI6, and no evidence he was a double agent, and no evidence of any connection to British intelligence whatsoever. So Stevens concluded that Paul was likely a low-level informant for French security services, someone who might tip them off about VIP movements at the Ritz. And I mean, we can note back to him yelling out of the car that you can't catch us and stuff, so it seems like he was just like a piece of shit, basically. And crucially, Henry Paul wasn't even supposed to work that night, and he had gone off duty hours earlier and was called back unexpectedly. So if this was an assassination, the assassins had somehow known to involve a man who wasn't scheduled to be there. And on the pregnancy claim, this was central to Al-Fayed's theory that Diana was carrying Dottie's child, and that this pregnancy was the motive for murder. But the forensic evidence was definitive, and that was that Diana was not pregnant. And Dr. Robert Chapman, who conducted the post-mortem examination, found no sign of pregnancy in her womb or ovaries. And forensic scientist Angela Gallup tested blood samples from the crash scene and found no trace of HCG hormone that indicates pregnancy. And Diana's close friends confirmed it. And Rosa Monckton, who had vacationed with Diana just days before her death, stated Diana had her period during their trip together. And Lady Annabelle Goldsmith, who spoke with Diana 2 days before the crash, quoted her saying, quote, "I need marriage like a rash on my face," unquote. So Diana was not pregnant, and Diana was also not engaged. So the foundation of Al-Fayed's conspiracy theory was factually false. And I can safely assume it was just driven by pure grief and rage. So we'll move on to the bright flash theory. And some witnesses claim to have seen a blinding white flash inside the tunnel just before the crash, supposedly a strobe device used by intelligence operatives to disorient Henry Paul. And Richard Tomlinson, a former MI6 officer, had initially suggested this was a technique used by intelligence services. But at the 2008 inquest, he backtracked dramatically, admitting he could not remember specifically any details about strobe lights. And more importantly, the primary witness who reported the flash, Francois Levistre, was contradicted by his own wife, who was sitting in the passenger seat of his car. And 4 other witnesses near the tunnel entrance reported seeing no flash either. And the forensic reconstruction showed that the sequence of events leading to the crash, Henry Paul clipping the Fiat, losing control, skidding into the pillar, began well before the location where any flash was supposedly even seen. So the physics just didn't work, and the flash theory was impossible. And that brings us to the Fiat Uno. So this remained the one genuine mystery, because the paint transfer evidence proved the Mercedes had made contact with a white Fiat Uno. And witnesses described seeing such a vehicle exit the tunnel erratically with a shattered taillight. But despite examining over 40,000 white Fiat Unos registered in the Paris area, investigators never definitively identified the car or its driver, which is crazy. I mean, I guess these people could have been leaving the country, I guess, but I don't know, that is very odd to me. But one suspect out of all of this emerged, and that was James Anderson, a French paparazzo who owned a white Fiat Uno and had allegedly boasted of intelligence connections. But Addison provided documentary evidence proving he was at his home, which was 177 miles from Paris, on the night of the crash, and his wife confirmed he was in bed with her. And in May of 2000, Anderson was found dead in a burnt-out BMW, ruled he did it himself. And conspiracy theorists seized on this as evidence of silencing, which, it seems like when people, to themselves, and they're involved in government things, it's a little suspicious. But investigators would find no connection to the crash. And the Fiat Uno driver was never found, but Stevens concluded this person was not the cause of the crash, merely an unlucky motorist who happened to be in the wrong place and was clipped by a speeding Mercedes and fled the scene out of fear, which seems to be the most probable theory. So on December 14th, 2006, Sir John Stevens held a press conference, and his words were unequivocal, saying, quote, "There was no conspiracy to murder any of the occupants of the car. This was a tragic accident. Our conclusion is that on the evidence available now, there was no conspiracy to murder any of the occupants of the car. Henry Paul, the driver of the Mercedes, was the cause of the crash." And he addressed Al-Fayed directly, saying, "I know that Mr. Al-Fayed has very strongly held personal opinions on this matter. I can only present the facts, the evidence, and my conclusions," unquote. And Operation Paget was the most comprehensive investigation into a single traffic accident in British history, and it changed nothing for Mohammed Al-Fayed, though. And he denounced the report completely, and he called it whitewash. And he demanded a public inquest with a jury and ordinary citizens who could hear the evidence and render their own verdict. And he got his wish. So an inquest is a peculiarly British institution. And unlike a trial, it doesn't determine guilt or innocence. Its purpose is narrower. It is to establish who died and where and when and how, and to answer formally and legally the question of what happened. So the inquests into the deaths of Diana, Princess of Wales, and Dodi Fayed began in October of 2007, more than 10 years after the crash. And Lord Justice Scott Baker presided, and the proceedings would last 6 months. And over 250 witnesses would testify, and the jury, 11 ordinary British citizens, would travel to Paris to walk through the Pont de l'Allemant tunnel themselves. And it would be the longest and most expensive inquest in British history, and Mohammed Al-Fayed would finally have his day in court. So for months, the inquest methodically reviewed everything. The forensics, the toxicology, the CCTV footage, the eyewitness accounts, the medical records, the phone records, the financial records, and witnesses who had been interviewed by French investigators and by Operation Paget returned to testify again. And their accounts were tested, challenged, and compared against the documentary evidence. And Trevor Rees-Jones, the sole survivor, took the stand. And he, as we said before, had no memory of the crash itself, because the head trauma had erased everything from the moment they left the Ritz until he woke up in the hospital. But he was clear on one point. He believed it was an accident, and there was no conspiracy and no assassination, just a drunk driver going too fast. And the medical experts confirmed again that Diana was not pregnant, and the postmortem was thorough, and the science was unambiguous, and there was no baby. And emergency responders detailed the agonizing timeline, the hour Diana spent at the crash scene, the slow ambulance journey, the frantic efforts to save her, and could she have survived with faster treatment? And the doctors debated this very, very intensely, and some believed the scoop and run approach used in Britain or America might have given her a chance, but others said the injury was simply too catastrophic, and that a torn pulmonary vein with a displaced heart was unsurvivable regardless of how quickly she reached the operating table. So there was no real consensus on that, and there never would be. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, and that was Mohammed Al-Fayed taking the stand in February of 2008. Because for years he had made his accusations through press releases and documentaries, but now he would make them under oath and subject to cross-examination in a court of law. And he did not disappoint. Because Al-Fayed called Prince Philip a Nazi and a racist, and he called the royal family the Dracula family, and he accused MI6 of orchestrating the murders, and he accused the British establishment of covering up the truth. And when pressed for evidence, he invoked Diana herself, and saying she had feared for her life, he said, and she had written letters predicting her own death, and she had known they were coming for her, saying, quote unquote, she knew, Diana knew. But under cross-examination, the foundations of his claims crumbled, and his own lawyers were forced to make a stunning admission, saying, quote, there is no direct evidence of royal or MI6 involvement in the deaths, unquote. They were asking the jury to infer a conspiracy from circumstantial evidence and alleged motives. And the direct evidence, the forensics, the toxicology, the eyewitness accounts, the phone records, the intelligence files all pointed in one direction, and that was an accident. And Al-Fayed left the stand unbowed and unrepentant and unconvinced. And he would never accept the truth. And not because the truth was hidden, but because the truth was unbearable. Because his son was dead, and Diana was dead, and there was no one to blame but a drunk driver and a terrible sequence of random events. And some losses are too great to attribute to chance. So on April 7th of 2008, the jury retired to consider their verdict. And they had 11 options, ranging from unlawful killing to accidental death to the open verdict favored by those who believed the truth could never be known. And they deliberated for hours, but when they returned, the foreman delivered a verdict that was both definitive and nuanced. And by a vote of 9-2, the jury found that Diana and Dottie had been unlawfully killed, but not murdered and not assassinated. Unlawfully killed through the grossly negligent driving of the following vehicles: the paparazzi, and the grossly negligent driving of the Mercedes driver, Henry Paul. So it was a split verdict, assigning blame to both the pursuers and the pursued. And contributing factors, the jury added, was Henry Paul's intoxication, the failure of any occupant to wear a seatbelt, the collision with the concrete pillar rather than the tunnel wall, and what the verdict was not was evidence to any conspiracy. So Lord Justice Scott Baker, summarizing the proceedings, was blunt, saying, quote, there was no evidence that Diana was pregnant. There was no evidence that there was an engagement ring. There was no evidence of any conspiracy to murder. Not a shred of evidence, unquote. And Prince William and Harry released a joint statement saying, quote, we agree with their verdicts and are both hugely grateful to each and every one of them, unquote. So it was a quiet endorsement and a desire for closure. And Mohammed Al-Fayed announced he would accept the verdict for the sake of Diana and Dottie's memory, he said, and to spare William and Harry further pain, saying, quote, I'm leaving it to history. Believe what you want to believe, unquote. But he never truly let it go. And in interviews over the following years, he would return again and again to his accusations, the Dracula family and the Nazis and the conspiracy. And he died in August of 2023, still believing his son had been murdered. But through all the investigations and thousands of witnesses and tens of thousands of pages of documentation, everybody came to the same conclusion, and that is that Diana, Princess of Wales, died because a drunk driver lost control of a speeding car in a Paris tunnel. No conspiracy, no assassination, no dark forces, just a terrible, senseless, preventable accident. But here's the thing about truth. Sometimes it isn't enough. And because Diana herself had feared this, she had written it down in October of 1995. She told her lawyer, Victor Mishkon, that, quote, reliable sources, unquote, had warned her of efforts to cause, quote, an accident in my car with prepared brake failure, unquote. And in October 1996, she wrote to her butler, Paul Burrell, saying, quote, my husband is planning an accident in my car. Brake failure and serious head injury in order to make the path clear for him to marry, unquote. And she named Charles, not Philip, and she feared her ex-husband, not the intelligence services. And she was wrong about who and how, and there was no brake failure and no planned assassination, but she was right about this. She did die in a car crash, and the most hunted woman in the world had predicted her own ending. And the coincidence, that terrible, inexplicable, haunting coincidence, is why the conspiracy theories will never fully die. And it's why I still don't fully believe it. I mean, it all makes sense, and there was, trial and everything, but there's something inside me that something feels off. And polls taken years after Diana's death consistently showed that a significant percentage of the public, sometimes a third, sometimes more, believed she had been murdered. And maybe it's part of the grief when someone that famous and that beloved, that alive, just dies so suddenly, and the mind rebels against randomness. There must be a reason. There's definitely something in my mind that just says there has to be a reason. There must be a villain. There must be something more than a drunk driver and an unlucky sequence of events. And part of it is just Diana herself. She had told people that she feared for her life, and she had written it down. And then she died exactly the way she predicted in a car crash. And part of it is just all the sheer weight of the unanswered questions. The missing fiat, Henry Paul's unexplained wealth, the hours he spent unaccounted for, the 3-hour gap that no one could explain. And the official investigations address these questions, but addressing a question isn't the same as answering it. And in the gaps between evidence and explanation, conspiracy theories take root.
We are now being told that Diana, Princess of Wales, who was reported to be injured in that accident you've just seen pictured of, has actually died in Paris's Salpêtrière hospital.
And the news traveled faster than anyone could process it. And by dawn on August 31st, 1997, the world knew. And radio stations interrupted their programming, and television networks scraped their schedules, and newspapers tore up their front pages and started over. Because Diana was dead. And the reaction was immediate and visceral and completely unprecedented. And in London, people woke to the news and didn't know what to do with themselves. So they went to Kensington Palace, and at first it was dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, and they came carrying flowers, single roses, elaborate bouquets, whatever they could find at petrol stations and corner shops on a Sunday morning. And they laid them at the gates, and they wrote cards, and they wept. And by the end of the first day, the flowers were knee-deep. And by the end of the week, they stretched 30 feet from the palace walls, an ocean of cellophane and petals, and around 60 million flowers in total, with 10,000 tons of bouquets. And the scent was so overwhelming, it was sickly sweet and almost suffocating, people would report. But people didn't just leave flowers. They left teddy bears and photographs and handwritten poems and children's drawings and candles that flickered through the night. And one woman even left her wedding dress. But strangers stood together and sobbed, and they hugged people they never met, and they waited in lines for hours just to sign condolence books. And eventually it was 43 of them filled with millions of signatures. But nothing like this has ever happened in Britain before, and nothing like this has happened anywhere else to this degree. And Prime Minister Tony Blair understood the moment immediately, because he had been in office for only 4 months, and he was young and media savvy and attuned to the public mood in ways the royal family had never been. And that Sunday morning, he stood outside a church in his constituency and delivered a statement that would define the tragedy. And his voice cracked as he spoke.
I feel like everyone else in this country today, utterly devastated. Our thoughts and prayers are with Princess Diana's family, in particular her 2 sons, the 2 boys. Our hearts go out to them.
And then he said the words that would follow her forever.
She was the people's princess, and that's how she will stay, how she will remain in our hearts and in our memories forever.
The people's princess. It was perfect. It was very true. And it threw into sharp relief the silence from the actual royal family. Because the royals weren't in London. They were at Balmoral, their Scottish estate, 500 miles away, and they weren't coming back. Because the Queen had made a decision. William and Harry needed to be protected. They needed privacy to grieve, and they would remain in Scotland, shielded from media frenzy, surrounded by family. And it was, by royal standards, the correct choice. A tradition and a protocol. The institution was protecting its own, but it was a catastrophic misreading of the moment. And the public didn't see a grieving grandmother protecting her grandsons. They saw a cold family hiding in a castle while their people wept in the streets. And then there was the flag. Because above Buckingham Palace, the flagpole stood bare. And this was tradition. The royal standard only flies when the monarch is in residence. And it never flies at half-mast because the monarchy never dies. And one sovereign succeeds another, and the institution continues. But the public didn't care about tradition. They saw an empty flagpole above a palace, while the nation drowned in grief, and they were furious. Quote unquote, "Where is our queen?" demanded the Sun. And quote unquote, "Where is her flag? Show us your care," pleaded the Express. And for 5 days, the queen said nothing, and the silence was deafening. And inside Balmoral, the family was fracturing, and Charles was devastated. Whatever their differences, Diana was the mother of his children, and now his sons were motherless, and he wanted to fly to Paris immediately to bring her body home. But the queen initially resisted, because Diana was no longer a royal, and she was no longer Her Royal Highness. A royal aircraft seemed inappropriate, but Charles reportedly exploded, and he would bring her home, and he would do it on a royal plane, whether the palace approved or not. He got it his way. But meanwhile, William and Harry existed in a kind of suspended animation, and they went to church that Sunday morning, which was tradition, and they walked to the Scottish moors, which was a tradition, and the adults around them seemed to believe that maintaining routine would somehow help. Which, what? And Harry would later describe those days as surreal, with the adults speaking in hushed tones and the forced normalcy and the sense that something enormous had happened, but no one quite knew how to acknowledge it. And he didn't cry. He kept waiting for the tears to come, but they didn't. And he began to wonder if something was wrong with him. And by Thursday, the pressure had become unbearable, and the Queen could no longer ignore the public rage. And Tony Blair's government was quietly warning that the monarchy itself was at risk, and that decades of goodwill were evaporating by the hour. And on September 4th, something unprecedented happened. And the Union Jack was raised above Buckingham Palace and lowered to half staff. And it was the first time in history the Queen had bent tradition, and the institution had bowed to the people. And that evening, Queen Elizabeth II finally spoke, and she addressed the nation in a live broadcast from Buckingham Palace, sitting before a window that looked out onto the crowds still gathered at the gates, still laying flowers, still weeping for a woman that the palace had never fully embraced.
Since last Sunday's dreadful news, we have seen throughout Britain and around the world an overwhelming expression of sadness at Diana's death. We have all been trying in our different ways to cope.
She spoke carefully, as she always did, and deliberately, without visible emotion, but with something that sounded almost like contrition.
I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. I admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her two boys.
And then a phrase that seemed designed to answer her critics.
I, for one, believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death.
It wasn't an apology. The Queen didn't apologize, but it was at least an acknowledgement. The closest the monarchy would ever come to admitting it had gotten something wrong. And the next day, the royal family finally returned to London. And Saturday, September 6th, 1997, was Diana's funeral. And the coffin had been lying in the state at St. James Palace, draped in royal standard, guarded by soldiers in crimson tunics. And that morning, it was placed on a horse-drawn gun carriage for the procession to Westminster Abbey. And the route stretched nearly 3.5 miles from Kensington Palace through Hyde Park, past Buckingham Palace, down the Mall to the Abbey. And it would take 2 hours. And the crowds began gathering before dawn. And by the time the procession began, over 1 million people lined the streets. And they stood 10, 15, 20 deep. And they perched on lampposts and climbed statues and pressed against barricades, and they held photographs of Diana, and they threw flowers at the coffin as it passed, and they were silent. And that was what everyone remembered afterward, the silence. 1 million people, and you could hear the horses' hooves on pavement, and you could hear the creak of the gun carriage wheels. No cheering, no chanting, just a sound of a city holding its breath. And some people wept quietly, and others stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. And strangers held hands, and behind the coffin, walking in the September sun, were 5 men: Prince Philip, Prince Charles, Earl Spencer, and 2 boys, William, who was 15, and Harry, who was 12. And the decision to have them walk had been controversial from the start. Earl Spencer opposed it, and he called it a barbarity, forcing 2 grieving children to perform their grief for the world's cameras. And Diana would have never wanted it, he said. But the palace insisted, and tradition demanded it, and the public expected it, and William was reluctant, and Harry was terrified. They were just children. But they were asked to march behind their mother's coffin for nearly 2 miles, surrounded by millions of strangers, with every camera on Earth pointed at their faces. And it was Prince Philip who finally settled it, saying, quote unquote, "I'll walk if you walk." And he would say that to his grandsons. So, they walked. And 15-year-old William, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed forward, refusing to look at the crowds, and 12-year-old Harry, smaller, slighter, his face a mask of confusion and grief. And years later, Harry would say, quote, "I don't think any child should be asked to do that under any circumstances," unquote. But he did it, and they both did, because it's what Windsors do, and they perform, and they don't let anyone see them break. And on top of the coffin lay a wreath of white roses, and tucked among the flowers a white envelope, and on it, in child's handwriting, a single word: mummy. And Westminster Abbey held 2,000 guests, heads of state and celebrities, charity workers and friends, and the famous and the anonymous seated side by side. And Queen Noor of Jordan, Hillary Clinton, Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg, Luciano Pavarotti, but the world wasn't watching them. The world, 2.5 billion people, nearly half the planet's population, was watching the service. And it remains one of the most viewed broadcasts in human history, and in Britain alone, 32.1 million people tuned in, and streets were emptied and offices closed, and the country simply stopped. And 2 moments from that service would become etched into memory forever. And the first was a song. Elton John had been Diana's friend for years, and they had a falling out shortly before her death, in one of those petty celebrity feuds, and they'd only just reconciled. And now he sat at the grand piano in Westminster Abbey preparing to sing a song he'd written 2 decades earlier about another icon who died too young. Candle in the Wind was originally about Marilyn Monroe. And in the days after Diana's death, Elton John and his lyricist Bernie Taupin rewrote the words, "Goodbye, England's Rose," he sang, "May you ever grow in our hearts." And he used a teleprompter, because he was terrified he would slip back into the original lyrics, and that he'd say Norma Jean instead of England's Rose, and desecrate the moment. But he didn't. And when he finished, the Abbey was silent, and then came the applause. Soft at first, then swelling, rolling through the pews like a wave. And Elton John has never performed that version of the song since, and he said he never will, not unless William and Harry personally ask him. And the recording came one of the best-selling singles of all time. It was 33 million copies, and all proceeds went to Diana's charities. And the second moment was the eulogy. Earl Spencer, Diana's younger brother, walked to the lectern, and he was handsome, composed, and furious. And what he delivered was not simply a tribute to his sister, it was an indictment. And he spoke of Diana's compassion, her humor, her gift for connection, and he spoke of her as a sister and not a symbol. But then his voice hardened, and he said,
"It is a point to remember that of all the ironies about Diana, perhaps the greatest was this. A girl given the name of the ancient goddess of hunting was, in the end, the most hunted person of the modern age."
But he wasn't finished, and he spoke of her vulnerability and deep feelings of unworthiness, a clear shot at the institution that had failed her. And he questioned whether the press had blood on their hands, and then he made a promise that landed like a grenade.
"I pledge that we, your blood family, will do all we can to continue the imaginative and loving way in which you are steering these 2 exceptional young men, so that their souls are not simply immersed by duty and tradition, but can sing openly as you planned."
Your blood family. All my praise goes to Earl Spencer, I tell you what. But he was talking about the Spencers, the people Diana had come from, not the people she'd married into. It was a declaration of war delivered from a pulpit to a global audience of billions. And when Spencer finished, there was silence. And then, from outside the Abbey, a sound like rain. But it wasn't rain, it was applause. rolling through the crowds on the streets, sweeping down the aisles and building until it filled the ancient church. And William and Harry joined in, and they clapped for their uncle, and they clapped for their mother. And the senior royals, the Queen, Prince Philip, Prince Charles, sat frozen. They did not applaud, and the cameras caught it all. And that afternoon, Diana was taken home, not to London, not to a royal vault, but to Althorpe, the Spencer family estate, where she'd been born and where she played as a child and where her family had lived for 500 years. And she was buried on a small island in the middle of an ornamental lake called the Round Oval. And the island was chosen deliberately, protected by water and thick mud, inaccessible to the public, safe from what Earl Spencer called the insane and ghoulish. And no cameras were present, and it was only family. But before they closed the coffin, they placed 2 items in Diana's hands, a photograph of William and Harry, and the letter Harry had written, the one addressed to Mummy. And we don't know what it said, and I hope we never will. Diana has been gone for almost 30 years, and somehow she's never left. And her sons have made sure of that. And in 2017, on the 20th anniversary of her death, William and Harry commissioned a statue for the sunken garden at Kensington Palace, the place where Diana had found peace, where she walked among the flowers, where mourners laid millions of bouquets in the days after she died. And on July 1st, 2021, what would have been her 60th birthday, they unveiled it together, and the brothers stood side by side, their relationship already fracturing, but united by one afternoon by the woman who had shaped them both, saying, quote, "Every day," they said in a joint statement, "we wish she were still with us." And her name lives on in their children, Princess Charlotte and Elizabeth Diana and Lilibet Diana, and the grandmother they'll never meet, written into their identities forever. And at the end of it all, she was truly the people's princess, and that is how she lived, and that is how she'll remain. But that is that for Princess Diana. Let me know what you guys think down below. I know this is more of almost a biography, but also conspiracy. I'd like to know what you guys think about it. If you have any fond memories of Princess Diana, even if you're not old enough to remember her necessarily like me. I was 1 when she passed away. But I mean, looking back, she was truly an icon. And she is missed by people who didn't even live in the same lifetime as her, including myself. But let me know what other cases you want me to look into. I always read the comments, and I will see you in the next episode. All right? Bye. The coroner ruled it a homicide. The jury called it manslaughter, and his family called it murder.
First of all, Michael told me that they were going to murder him.
He was the most famous person alive, and he sold more records than anyone in history. And he owned a catalog worth billions, and he spent his final years telling everyone around him that someone was going to kill him for it. But nobody listened. And then in 2024, his name resurfaced in the Epstein files, and the whole world started asking questions again. But they were asking the wrong ones. This is the mysterious life and death of Michael Jackson. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. Today, we are talking about one of the most famous human beings ever, and how he came to be that famous, and what happened because of it. And there's a lot of things in here I had no idea about, especially with all the Epstein stuff coming out and everything. It is going to be a jam-packed video. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam all the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this Michael Jackson life and death deep dive video together. So the story of Michael Jackson begins not with him, but with a place, and with the people that place made. Gary, Indiana was a company town in the most literal sense, founded in 1906 by the United States Steel Corporation and named for the chairman of its board, Albert Henry Gary. The city existed to feed the furnaces. Gary Works, stretching along the southern shore of Lake Michigan, would grow into the largest steel mill on Earth. and the jobs would draw tens of thousands of families northward during the Great Migration. And by 1960, the population would peak at around 178,000 people. And the air in this place just tasted like metal. And the work was dangerous, and the pay was steady, and the neighborhoods were segregated, and the churches were full on Sundays. And among those who came north was a man born into that migration's current, Joseph Walter Jackson, who arrived in the world on July 26, 1928, in Fountain Hill, a small community in Ashley County, Arkansas, and deep in that flat cotton country of the southeastern delta, barely a mile from the Louisiana line. And his father, Samuel Joseph Jackson, was a school teacher the locals would call Professor Jackson, and his mother was Crystal Lee King, so the family carried within it the tangled bloodlines of the American South. Joe's grandfather, Israel Nero Jackson, born in 1838, had been enslaved, and his great-grandfather, July Jack Gale, was said to have been a U.S. Army scout who claimed Native American heritage, though the specifics of that claim, sometimes identified as Choctaw, are difficult to verify through surviving records. So Joe moved to East Chicago, Indiana at 18, and he was a physically imposing man with large hands and a hard stare, and he found work in the way other African American men in the region found work, at the mills. And he would become an overhead crane operator at Inland Steel Company and later worked at American Foundries, also in East Chicago. And the hours working there were long, and the labor was grinding. And somewhere in the repetition of shifts and paychecks, Joe Jackson began to understand that he wanted something else, something that made noise, that moved a crowd, that refused to be ordinary. And the woman who would share that wanting and temper it with something quieter and more enduring had her own story of migration and survival. Katie B. Screws was born on May 4th, 1930 in Clayton, a town in Barber County, Alabama, the same red clay country that produced George Wallace. And at 2 years old, she would contract polio, and the disease would leave her with a permanent limp and a slight drag in her left leg that she would carry for the rest of her life. And when she was 4, the family would move north to East Chicago, joining the same stream of Southern African American families chasing the promise of the mills. But despite the polio, Katie, who would later go by Catherine, was deeply musical. She played piano, clarinet, and the cello, and she sang. And she absorbed the country gospel of her Alabama childhood and the rhythms of Indiana, and she would carry music inside her the way some people carry prayer. So Joe and Catherine met in 1947 in East Chicago, and she was 17 at the time, and he was already briefly married to a woman named Isaphine Atkinson, though that marriage was very short-lived. So Joe and Catherine married on November 5th, 1949, and in January 1950, they purchased a small house at 2300 Jackson Street in Gary for $8,500. Different times, I tell you what. And the house was around 672 square feet, with 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and it sat on a modest lot in a working-class neighborhood, on the west side of Gary, close enough to the mill that you could hear the machinery if the wind was right. And into the house, over the next 16 years, Joe and Catherine Jackson would bring 10 children, a quantity of human life that the square footage could barely contain, stacked in bunk beds, sharing everything, privacy, a concept that existed only in theory. So in the early 1950s, Joe and his brother Luther formed a blues band called the Falcons, sometimes known as Ford Falcons. And Joe played guitar and Luther played saxophone. And they gigged around the region in the networks of industrial cities south of Chicago that included Gary, East Chicago, and Hammond, playing the kind of electric blues that poured out of every juke joint and house party in those neighborhoods. And they were pretty decent, but the Falcons would never land any record deal. And after a few years, the band dissolved and Joe put his guitar in the closet. But he did not put away the ambition, as we know. And he folded it up and stored it somewhere deeper, in a place where it would eventually be redirected with ferocious, sometimes brutal precision. And that was toward his children. Now, the children came in rapid succession, and each one entered a household that was growing louder, more crowded, and more volatile. Now, Maureen Rylette, or Rebby, was born first on May 29, 1950, and then Sigmund Esco, or Jackie, on May 4th, 1951, and then Toriano Adderall, or Tito, on October 15th, 1953, and then Jermaine on December 11th, 1954, and then LaToya Yvonne on May 29th, 1956, then Marlon David on March 12th, 1957, along with his twin brother, Brandon, who drew a single breath and died the next day, unfortunately, on March 13th, 1957. And the death of Brandon was not discussed in the Jackson household. It was absorbed into the silence that families built around their worst losses. Just a ghost twin whose absence Marlon could carry quietly for decades. And then, on August 29th, 1958, at St. Mary's Mercy Hospital in Gary, Michael Joseph Jackson was born. And he was the 8th child, the 7th living, technically, and he had arrived in a house that was already overflowing, with children, with noise, with Joe's thwarted ambitions and Catherine's quiet faith, and the ever-present economic pressure of a steelworker's wage stretched across a family that would eventually number 11. And 2 more children would follow, Stephen Randall, or Randy, on October 29th, 1961, and Janet Demita Joe on May 16th, 1966. And in 1963, Catherine would convert to the Jehovah's Witness faith and was baptized. And the religion would shape the Jackson household profoundly with its door-to-door evangelism and its prohibition on holidays and birthdays, its apocalyptic worldview, its emphasis on spiritual discipline. And it was Catherine's faith, not Joe's, and it would live inside Michael Jackson for the rest of his life, even as he struggled with it, even as he left and returned to it, and even as it complicated everything. Now, Joe Jackson was, by virtually every account, including those of his children, a strict and sometimes physically abusive father, because he demanded obedience and he demanded excellence. And when the guitar came back out of the closet, this time not for Joe's own playing, but for his son's, the discipline that governed the household became something closer to a regime. Now, the guitar was forbidden, and that was the rule. Joe kept it in the bedroom closet, a cheap electric model, nothing special, but it was his, a relic of the Falcons, and the dream that hadn't worked out. And the children were not to touch it, because Joe was at the mill during the day, and the children were not supervised every minute. And Tito, the third born, the quiet one, the one with the large hands like his father's, could not stay away from it. And he would wait until Joe left for his shift, then slide the closet door open and take out the guitar carefully, the way you would handle something you've been told to never handle. And he would teach himself to play by ear, picking out the songs he heard on the radio. The Temptations, the Four Tops, the electric blues his father used to play in the clubs. And he was getting pretty good. And then, one day in 1964, he broke a string. And the discovery could have gone badly, because in the Jackson household, disobedience was met with a belt, a switch, or a cord, whatever was in the closet. But something shifted in Joe when he heard Tito play. The boy had talent, real talent. And Joe Jackson, the man whose own band had never gotten a record deal, the crane operator who went to work every day in a city that was already beginning to die, recognized in his son's stolen guitar playing the second chance he had been waiting for. So, he didn't punish Tito, he bought him a guitar. And what followed was the formation of a family band with the discipline of a military unit and the ambition of a Fortune 500 company. And in 1964, Joe organized the Jackson brothers, Tito on guitar, Jackie and Jermaine on vocals, plus 2 neighborhood friends, Raynaud Jones and Milford Height, filling out the rhythm. And they rehearsed in the living room of 2300 Jackson Street in that 672 square foot house where the walls were thin enough to hear everything and the neighbors could hear them too. And Joe ran rehearsals the way he ran everything, with absolute authority. Guy was a tyrant. And mistakes were not tolerated, and repetition was the method. Fear was the motivator. And by August 1965, 2 more Jackson brothers had joined the group. Marlon, who was 8, and Michael, who was only 6 years old. And the neighborhood friends would slowly be eased out, because this was now all a Jackson operation. And at a performance at Gary's Tino Tots Jamboree, a woman named Evelyn LaHaye suggested the group needed a proper name. And someone, accounts vary on exactly who, proposed the Jackson 5. And the name stuck. And Michael, at 6 years old, was not yet the lead singer, though. That role belonged to Jermaine, who had a smooth, reliable tenor. And Michael sang backup and danced. But even in those earliest performances, talent shows at elementary schools, community centers, local clubs where children probably shouldn't have been, something was visibly different about the youngest performer on stage. He moved with an intuition that couldn't be taught. He watched James Brown on television with the focus of a graduate student, absorbing every spin, every split, every way Brown used his body to make the crowd lose its utter mind. And he studied Jackie Wilson, and he studied the Temptations choreography, and then he did it better than any child had a right to. And in 1966, the Jackson 5 won their first talent show at Theodore Roosevelt High School in Gary, and it was the beginning of a streak. And Joe entered them into every competition he could find, driving them across Indiana. The family packed into a Volkswagen van that barely held them all, and they won. And they kept winning, and Joe booked them into rougher venues, bars, strip clubs, places where a group of children performed between adult acts, and the audience threw money if they were good and bottles if they weren't. Just sketchy as places where kids should not be. And Michael later described watching striptease acts as a small child, standing in the wings waiting for the Jackson 5's turn, and he was now 9 years old. And by mid-1967, a shift had taken place within the group that everyone could hear Michael's voice. Still a child's voice, still high and clear, had developed a quality that Jermaine simply didn't possess. And it wasn't just range or pitch, it was just emotion, an almost unsettling ability to inhabit a lyric's feeling and project it outward with adult conviction. So Joe made a decision. Michael replaced Jermaine as lead singer, or Jermaine. Damn! So the group's center of gravity moved permanently to the youngest brother on stage. And on August 13th, 1967, they won amateur night at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, the most famous proving ground of African American entertainment, and the stage where Ella Fitzgerald and James Brown and Stevie Wonder had been discovered, where the audience was legendarily unforgiving and the hook was not a metaphor. And at this point, Michael was 8 years old, and the Apollo audience gave them a standing ovation. So the question of who discovered the Jackson 5 is one of the foundational myths of the Motown era, and like most myths, it obscures a messier truth. The official story is the one that Berry Gordy wanted told, the one printed on the debut album cover, which was that Diana Ross discovered the Jackson 5. But it was just a marketing masterstroke, the biggest female star in black music presenting the next generation, a laying on of hands from Motown royalty to Motown future. And the first Jackson 5 album was titled Diana Ross Presents the Jackson 5. And Ross appeared at their early press events, and the implication was clear and very deliberate. And it was also largely fiction. Which at this point, I mean, it started back then, you know? All this stuff, like I went over Taylor Swift and how her whole life was manufactured. It's interesting looking at the parallels and just, I've only gone into two major artists now, but the parallels are crazy, how much they're manufactured and how much smoke and mirrors there are in the entertainment industry. But the true discoverer was Bobby Taylor, a singer and band leader from Motown's second tier who fronted Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers. Because Taylor saw the Jackson 5 perform at the Regal Theater in Chicago, the South Side equivalent of the Apollo, and was stunned. And he brought them to Motown's attention, arranged their audition, and produced their early recordings. And Gladys Knight also deserves a footnote in the discovery narrative, because she saw the Jackson 5 at the Regal in 1967 as well, and was so impressed that she sent a demo tape to Motown on their behalf, but the tape was rejected. And the irony is almost too good, because one of Motown's biggest stars recommending a group that would become Motown's biggest act was being ignored. But the formal audition took place on July 23rd, 1968 at Hitsville, USA, Motown's legendary headquarters on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit, the converted house with a hand-painted sign that had produced more #1 hits than any address in America. And the Jackson brothers performed in the studio, and Berry Gordy, contrary to what some accounts have suggested, was not present for the audition, and he saw a tape of it later. But the Motown staff who were in the room that day knew immediately what they were looking at. Michael, now 9 years old, performed with a precision and emotional range that was difficult to reconcile with his age. And he sang like a man who had been heartbroken, and he had never been on a date at this point, obviously because he's 9. and Motown signed the Jackson 5, and the machine began to turn. So in mid-August 1969, Joe moved the boys to California, and Catherine and the rest of the children didn't join until November. And for the Jackson brothers from Gary, Indiana, from the 672 square foot house on Jackson Street, from the steel smoke air and the frozen winters and the talent shows at Theodore Roosevelt High, Los Angeles was another planet. The light was different, the air smelled like jasmine instead of sulfur, and the houses had swimming pools. And on October 1st, 1969, Michael, now 11 years old, moved temporarily into the Hollywood Hills home of Diana Ross, and he lived with her for about a month while the family's permanent arrangements were being finalized. And Ross became a kind of surrogate older sister and glamorous mentor to Michael. And Michael absorbed her elegance, her poise, her understanding of how a star just occupied space. And he watched her the way he watched everything, just silently, totally storing it all for later use. And then Motown released the single. And the velocity of what happened next has no real parallel in the history of popular music. Because on October 7th, 1969, less than 2 months after the family arrived in California, Motown released I Want You Back, the Jackson 5's debut single. And the song was a masterpiece of pure pop construction. A bouncing bass line, a staccato piano chords, a horn section that punched like a fist, and riding above all of it was the voice of an 11-year-old boy singing about romantic heartbreak with conviction that made you forget he was 11. Because the vocal performance was technically extraordinary, with the phrasing, the breath control, the way Michael bent notes and slid between registers. But what made it transcendent was something harder to name. There was joy in it. There was urgency. There was a child's voice carrying an adult's emotion within it, without any question. And the effect was just electrifying. And I Want You Back reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 on January 31st, 1970. And Michael Jackson was 11 years old, making him the youngest artist to ever top the chart. And the record sold over 2 million copies in its first 6 weeks. And what followed was just unprecedented. And the Jackson 5 became the first recording act in history to debut with 4 consecutive #1 singles. Not the first group, not the first family act, but the first act of any kind. And the streak unfolded with the mechanical precision of a Motown hit factory operating at peak efficiency. And I Want You Back, #1, January 31st, 1970. ABC, #1, April 25th, 1970. The song knocked the Beatles' Let It Be out of the top spot, which is crazy. It was just a symbolic passing of the generational torch that the music press seized upon with just utter glee. And then the Love You Save, #1, June 27th, 1970, and I'll Be There, which was #1, October 17th, 1970. And this one was a ballad, the one that proved the Jackson 5 were not merely a novelty act built on energy and choreography. I'll Be There was tender and restrained and just very sincere. And Michael sang it as though comforting someone through a crisis. And the performance was so emotionally mature that it unsettled people even. Because where the hell did a child learn to just feel like that? How did a boy from a 2-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana develop the capacity to communicate grief and reassurance with the authority of someone who had already lived in a full life? And nobody had an answer. And the song became the Jackson 5's biggest selling single, moving over 4 million copies. 4 singles, 4 #1s, 9 months. The group had arrived in California as unknowns and became, by the end of 1970, the biggest act in popular music. So the fame was crazy. And by 1971, the Jackson 5 had their own Saturday morning cartoon, Jackson 5 with the 5 instead of the F, which aired on ABC from 1971 to 1972, rendering the brothers as animated characters in weekly adventures. And they were on lunchboxes and bedroom posters and magazine covers. And teenage girls screamed at their concerts that drew comparisons to Beatlemania. And the Jackson 5 were selling arenas across the country. And at the center of every performance, drawing every eye, generating every gasp, was Michael. And that very year, the family purchased the Havenhurst estate, a sprawling compound on a tree-lined street in Encino in the San Fernando Valley, for approximately $250,000. And the Jackson 5 had crossed this line in less than 5 years. And Michael, at this point, was 12 years old. And he was the most famous child in America by far. And the machine was just getting started. As Michael Jackson's solo recording career began while he was still a child inside of this machine. And in June 1971, at 12 years old, he entered Motown's studio without his brothers for the first time. And his debut solo single, Got to Be There, was released that October. A gentle, yearning love song that proved his voice could carry a record on its own. And the following year, Ben, a ballad sung to a rat from the horror film of the same name, became his first #1 pop solo single, and he was 13 at that point. And he had a #1 hit and a Saturday morning cartoon and a family act that was still selling out arenas, and none of it was enough. Not for Joe, and not for Michael either, and increasingly not for the brothers, who were growing restless under Motown's ironclad creative control. And the break came in 1975, though, and the Jacksons signed a contract with CBS Records' Epic label in June, leaving Motown behind. And the reasons were partly financial, because Motown had been paying a royalty rate of 2.7%, a figure that bordered on exploitative even by the standards of the era, while Epic offered dramatically more. But the deeper issue was creative freedom. And at Motown, the Jackson 5 recorded songs chosen for them, produced by staff producers with virtually no input into their own material. And Epic would promise them the right to write and produce. But there was a cost. Motown retained ownership of the name Jackson 5, forcing the group to rebrand as the Jacksons. And Jermaine, married to Berry Gordy's daughter Hazel, stayed behind at Motown, a choice that fractured something in the family they never fully healed from. So the moment Michael Jackson stopped being a former child star and became something unprecedented arrived through a movie musical nobody expected to matter. And in 1977, Jackson was cast as the Scarecrow in The Wiz, an all-African-American reimagining of The Wizard of Oz, starring Diana Ross. And the film itself was a commercial disappointment, actually. But on set, Jackson met Quincy Jones, the legendary producer and arranger who was serving as the film's musical supervisor and producer. Now, Jones was 54, a veteran of Count Basie's orchestra and Frank Sinatra's recording sessions, a man who had worked at the highest levels of jazz, pop, film, scoring, and R&B for 3 decades. A big deal, all right? And he heard something in the now 19-year-old Michael Jackson that went beyond talent. A perfectionism, an obsessive work ethic, a willingness to be pushed, probably from his father. And Jackson asked Jones to produce his next solo album, and Jones agreed. So they recorded from December 1978 through June 1979, and Off the Wall was released on August 10th, 1979, and it was a revelation, if you know anything about Michael Jackson. The future album just fused disco, funk, pop, and R&B into something seamlessly sophisticated. Just adult music made by a 20-year-old who sang with the authority of someone twice his age, just like when he was a kid. He just had this maturity about himself and his voice that was just unprecedented. And Don't Stop Till You Get Enough and Rock... It's hard not to sing these titles. So Don't Stop Till You Get Enough and Rock With You both reached #1. And the album sold over 20 million copies worldwide, and it won the Grammy for Best R&B Vocal Performance for Males. But it did not win Album of the Year, somehow. And that loss stung Michael Jackson in a way that people around him recognized as something more than disappointment. It was just fuel for him, because he had made one of the best-selling albums in history, and the Recording Academy had just looked past it. And he told people close to him that the next album would be so big they couldn't ignore it, and he meant it. And what he made next was the best-selling album in the history of recorded music. Thriller was recorded between April 14th and November 8th of 1982 at Westlake Recording Studios in Los Angeles, with Quincy Jones again producing. And the budget was $750,000, expensive for the era, but modest for what it became. And Jackson wrote 4 of the 9 tracks: Wanna Be Startin' Something, The Girl Is Mine, Beat It, and Billie Jean. Just masterpieces of music. Oh my God. And the album was released on November 29th, 1982. And the numbers that followed defied any simple comprehension because Thriller spent 37 non-consecutive weeks at number 1 on the Billboard 200. It was the best-selling album of 1983. It was the best-selling album of 1984. And all 7 of its singles reached the top 10. Billie Jean held the number 1 spot for 7 weeks, and Beat It, which featured a guitar solo by Eddie Van Halen, who's one of my favorite guitarists ever, held it for 3. And estimated total sales have reached 70 million copies worldwide, a figure no other album has even approached. And I'm talking about one album specifically. Don't come in my comments and be like, oh, what about the Beatles or Taylor Swift? No, okay? This is the top-selling album of all time, all right? But the cultural machinery around Thriller was as revolutionary as the music itself. And when MTV, still in its infancy and programming almost exclusively white rock acts, initially declined to air the Billie Jean video, and CB Records president Walter Yetnikoff reportedly threatened to pull all CBS content from the network, and MTV relented. In the video, Jackson, in a pink shirt and white sequin socks, dancing under streetlights on a sidewalk whose tiles illuminated beneath his feet, became the network's most requested clip and effectively integrated MTV. And the 13-minute Thriller short film, directed by John Landis and budgeted between $500,000 and $900,000, functioned less as a music video than a miniature horror movie. I remember the first time I watched it, my mind was blown, to say the least. But it was so elaborate that Michael Jackson, a practicing Jehovah's Witness troubled by the occult imagery, ordered the negatives destroyed before his attorney, John Branca, convinced him to simply add a disclaimer. And in 2009, it became the first music video inducted into the National Film Registry. And on February 28, 1984, Thriller won 8 Grammy Awards, a record at the time. But the image that sealed Thriller's mythology in the public consciousness had come 10 months earlier on a television stage. Because on May 16, 1983, NBC broadcast Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, and Forever, a reunion special celebrating Motown Records' 25th anniversary. And approximately 47 million people watched, which is a lot. And Jackson performed Billie Jean, and during the performance, in a moment that he had rehearsed privately for weeks after learning the move from a dancer named Garen Katzper Candidate in June 1981, he executed the moonwalk for the first time on live television. Iconic! And the other performers backstage watched the monitors in silence. And Fred Astaire called Jackson the next morning, and in a single fluid backward glide, 6 seconds, maybe 7, Michael Jackson passed from stardom into something that had no adequate name. And less than a year after the Motown 25 performance on January 27, 1984, Michael Jackson was filming a Pepsi commercial at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. And on the 6th take, pyrotechnics ignited too close to his head, and his hair caught fire. And he suffered second-degree burns to his scalp, and crew members rushed to extinguish the flames, and Jackson was taken to hospital, where he was treated and released. And Pepsi settled the resulting claim, and Jackson donated $1.5 million of the settlement to the Bronfman Medical Center, which renamed its burn center in his honor. Just like so sweet. And in his autopsy, decades later, would reveal that Jackson was almost completely bald beneath the wigs he wore for the rest of his life from that. But the deeper wound was pharmaceutical. To manage the pain from the burn and subsequent reconstructive procedures, Jackson was prescribed opioid painkillers. And nearly every person close to him would later identify the Pepsi burn as the starting point of the prescription drug dependency that shadowed the rest of his life and ultimately contributed to his untimely death. But the third and final collaboration between Jackson and Quincy Jones was Bad, recorded from 1985 to 1987 and released on August 31st, 1987. And Michael Jackson wrote 9 of the album's 11 tracks, a dramatic increase in creative control from Thriller, and the album sold 2.25 million copies in its first week and generated a record 5 consecutive #1 singles from a single album. And the title track's music video was directed by Martin Scorsese and featured a young Wesley Snipes. And total sales exceeded 35 million copies worldwide. And the Bad World Tour, September 12th, 1987 through January 27th, 1989, was 123 concerts across 15 countries, grossing $125 million. And Diana, Princess of Wales, attended the July 16th, 1988 show at the Wembley Stadium. And Bad was, by an objective measure, one of the most successful albums ever released. And it was also the first time Jackson encountered the peculiar burden of his own success. Because Bad was treated in certain critical quarters as a disappointment, not because it failed by any measure, but because it was not Thriller. Because nothing could be. The standard he had set was inhuman, and it would follow him like a shadow for the rest of his career. So in 1985, between the triumph of Thriller and the recording of Bad, Michael Jackson made the business decision that would define his financial life, and some believe his death. Paul McCartney, during their collaborations on The Girl Is Mine and Say Say Say, had explained to Jackson how music publishing worked, that owning the rights to songs was where the real money lived, not performing or recording them. And Michael listened carefully. And when the ATV music publishing catalog came up for sale, a portfolio of roughly 4,000 songs, including 251 compositions by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, Jackson pursued it aggressively. And the purchase closed on approximately August 10th, 1985 for $47.5 million. And Michael Jackson now owned Yesterday, Hey Jude, and Let It Be, and dozens of other songs that formed the bedrock of 20th century popular music. And McCartney, who wanted the catalog himself, was reportedly furious. And the friendship never recovered. And the catalog would appreciate enormously over the following decades, and in 1995, Michael Jackson merged his holdings with Sony Music's publishing division to create Sony ATV Music Publishing, a joint venture in which he retained a 50% stake. So by the time of his death, the catalog was valued at approximately $1 billion. And by 2016, when Sony purchased the estate's share for $750 million, estimates had climbed to $4 billion. So the catalog made Michael Jackson extraordinarily wealthy on paper, so it also made him a target. And he would spend the last years of his life telling people that someone was going to kill him for it. So after Bad, Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones parted ways professionally. And for Dangerous, released in 1991, Jackson turned to Teddy Riley, the pioneer of New Jack Swing, and the album's sound reflected the shift. Harder, more rhythmically aggressive, and more experimental. And it was Jackson's first album without Jones since Forever Michael in 1975. And it sold 32 million copies worldwide. And on January 31st, 1993, Jackson headlined the halftime show at the Super Bowl in Pasadena. And it was the first major music superstar to do so. And it's iconic. I mean, he's just like standing on stage and just the crowd screaming, and he's just sitting there just soaking it in. It's the best Super Bowl, in my opinion, right next to Prince. And the performance was a spectacle of unprecedented scale. Like I said, when Jackson stood motionless on stage for 90 seconds while the crowd roared, then launched into a medley that included Jam, Billie Jean, and Heal the World, it was the first Super Bowl halftime where ratings increased between halves, a phenomenon that transformed the halftime show from a bathroom break afterthought into the premier live performance slot in American entertainment. And every halftime spectacle since, Prince, Beyonce, Shakira, which are also amazing shows, exists in the template Jackson created that afternoon. And History, Past, Present, and Future, Book 1, released in 1995, was a double album, one disc of greatest hits, one of new material. And it contained You Are Not Alone, which became the first song in Billboard history to debut at number 1 on the Hot 100, and the History World Tour that followed him from 1996 to 1997 covered 82 concerts across 35 countries and grossed $165 million, the highest-grossing solo tour of the 90s. And by the mid-90s, Michael Jackson had sold more records than any solo artist in history. And he had invented the modern music video, and he had integrated MTV, and he had transformed the Super Bowl halftime show. He owned the most valuable music publishing catalog on Earth, and he was, by virtually any metric, the most famous human being alive. And then, everything began to fall apart, because behind the stage lights and the record sales and the increasingly surreal scale of the fame, there was a person. And that person was unwell in ways the public was only beginning to understand, and lonely in ways the public could not have imagined. And the health problems came first, and they came early. So in 1983, going back a little bit in time, Dr. Arnold Klein, a Beverly Hills dermatologist who would become one of the most consequential and controversial figures in Jackson's life, diagnosed him with discoid lupus erythematosus, an autoimmune condition affecting the skin. And 3 years later, in 1986, Klein delivered a second diagnosis, vitiligo, a condition in which the immune system attacks the melanocytes that produce skin pigment, creating irregular patches of depigmentation across the body. And for any person, vitiligo is a difficult diagnosis. But for a black man who was the most photographed human being on the planet, a man whose changing appearance was already the subject of relentless tabloid speculation, it was catastrophic. And Jackson would not publicly disclose the vitiligo until February 10th, 1993, in a live interview with Oprah Winfrey, watched by 90 million people. And by then, years of tabloid cruelty had calcified a narrative that Jackson was bleaching his skin out of self-hatred or racial confusion. But the truth was a medical condition he had not chosen and could not control. And his autopsy 16 years later would confirm the diagnosis definitively, documenting focal depigmentation across 5 areas of his body. And then came the Pepsi burn in January 1984, which we talked about previously, and with it, the opioid prescriptions that introduced Jackson to a pharmaceutical world he would never fully leave. And in 1993, after the crisis that would engulf him that year, Elizabeth Taylor personally led an intervention. And Jackson entered rehab at a facility in London and completed a 12-step program, and the dependency retreated but did not disappear. It would return in different forms with different substances across different doctors for the rest of his life. And the most dangerous of those substances was propofol, a powerful intravenous anesthetic used in hospitals to induce unconsciousness for surgery. And Jackson began using propofol during the History World Tour in 1996 to 1997. Administered by anesthesiologists he hired to travel with him, and he used it to sleep. For a man suffering from chronic and debilitating insomnia, a condition that worsened with every passing year, propofol offered the only reliable path to unconsciousness. But it was not sleep in any medical sense. It suppressed REM cycles entirely, offering oblivion without rest. And an expert who testified in 2013 estimated that Jackson may have gone 60 days without REM sleep before his death, which is catastrophic. So his brain, by the end, was being deprived of the very thing sleep is supposed to provide. And if Jackson's health was quietly deteriorating through the 1980s and 1990s, his personal world was also taking shape in ways the public found endlessly fascinating and largely incomprehensible. Because the friendships came first, and the most important of them was Elizabeth Taylor. They met in the mid-1980s, likely at a Victoria Tour concert at Dodger Stadium in late 1984. And the connection was immediate and deep. Two people who had been child stars, who had grown up inside fame's distortion field, who understood what it cost to be watched by millions before you understood who you even were. And Taylor became Jackson's fiercest defender and closest confidant. And on April 12, 1989, at the Soul Train Awards, she introduced him with the title that would follow him permanently, the King of Pop. And on October 6, 1991, Michael Jackson hosted her 8th wedding to Larry Fortensky at Neverland Ranch. And their friendship lasted over 25 years until Taylor's death in 2011. And she was, by many accounts, one of the very few people on Earth who could speak to Michael Jackson honestly and be heard. And his meeting with Princess Diana was briefer, but no less meaningful to him. Because on July 16, 1988, like we said before, Diana attended his Bad World Tour show at Wembley Stadium. And Jackson had removed Dirty Diana from the set list out of concern that the title might embarrass her. And Diana, learning of this, reportedly requested that he perform it, and he did. And they met only that once in person backstage at Wembley. And when Diana was killed in a car crash on August 31st, 1997, Jackson was so shaken that he postponed his scheduled performance in Austin, Belgium, moving it from August 31st to September 3rd. And if you want to know more about Diana's death, I will link that video that I covered her whole life and mysterious death down below. And in 1988, Jackson purchased the property that would become the physical manifestation of his inner world. Neverland Valley Ranch sat on approximately 2,700 acres in the Santa Ynez Valley near Los Olivos, California, with rolling golden hills studded with oak trees, an hour and a half northeast of Los Angeles. And the purchase price was somewhere between $17 and $19.5 million, depending on the source. Now, the main residence was roughly 12,600 square feet, but the house was almost beside the point, because what Jackson built around it was something between a private theme park and a living fairy tale. A Ferris wheel, a carousel, a miniature railroad, a zoo with giraffes and elephants and chimpanzees, a movie theater, gardens, just anything and everything, you name it, that you would have wanted to see as a kid, it was there. And he named it after the island in Peter Pan where children never grow up. And the symbolism was not subtle, as Jackson identified with Peter Pan openly and repeatedly throughout his life.
He said to me that he's Peter Pan, and I feel that way too, and I guess we have the same feel about life.
Because he saw childhood as something sacred and something that had been stolen from him. And Neverland became Jackson's refuge, his creative workspace, and eventually the setting of the accusations that nearly destroyed him. Because he would live there on and off for nearly 2 decades before the property became too painful to inhabit. And it would be sold in December of 2020, more than 11 years after his death, for $22 million. Now, the romantic relationships were few, intense, and brief. And Jackson and Lisa Marie Presley first crossed paths as children, backstage at a Las Vegas concert in approximately 1974 or 1975. When she was about 7 and he was about 17. And her father was Elvis Presley, as we know, and his father was Joe Jackson. So they were, in a sense, the only 2 people on Earth who could fully understand each other's childhoods. And they would reconnect as adults in November 1992 when Jackson was in the earliest stages of his personal crisis that would soon become public. And their conversations grew frequent and intimate. And on May 26, 1994, 20 days after her divorce from musician Danny Q was finalized, they married in a private ceremony in the Dominican Republic. And the world reacted with almost uniform disbelief. The tabloids treated the marriage as a publicity stunt, a strategic alliance between 2 famous names designed to rehabilitate Jackson's image during the fallout from the 1993 allegations. And on September 8th, 1994, at the MTV Video Music Awards, Jackson and Presley appeared on stage together, and he leaned over and kissed her. And the audience didn't know whether to cheer or cringe. And it remains one of the most analyzed public kisses in entertainment history. But whatever the marriage was, and Presley would later insist, credibly and emotionally, that it was real, it did not last. And they separated on December 10th, 1995. And Presley filed for divorce on January 18th, 1996, and it was finalized on August 20th, 1996. And in all her later accounts of the relationship, Presley described Jackson as deeply loving, but also deeply troubled, consumed by prescription drugs, and surrounded by enablers she couldn't penetrate. And she told Oprah Winfrey in 2010 that in one of their final conversations in 2005, Jackson had told her that someone was going to kill him for his music catalog. And she confirmed he gave her specific names, and she declined to share them for whatever reason. And the second marriage was different in almost every way, as Debbie Rowe was a nurse in Dr. Arnold Klein's dermatology office. And she and Jackson had known each other for years through Klein's practice, and on November 14th, 1996, less than 3 months after the Presley divorce was finalized, Jackson and Rowe married in Sydney, Australia. And she was 6 months pregnant, and their first child, Michael Joseph Jackson Jr., called Prince, was born on February 13th, 1997. And their second, Paris Michael Catherine Jackson, was born on April 3rd, 1998. And the marriage appeared from outside and arguably from the inside to be primarily an arrangement for producing children. And Rowe would later describe the relationship in transactional terms, saying she had agreed to bear Jackson's children because she saw how much he wanted to be a father. But they would divorce in approximately April of 2000, with Rowe receiving an $8 million settlement and initially relinquishing custody. And Jackson's third child, Prince Michael Jackson II, originally called Blanket, later Biggie, was born on February 21st, 2002 via surrogate. And the identity of the surrogate and the biological mother has never been publicly confirmed. And on November 19th, 2002, Jackson committed the single most damaging public relations act of his career that didn't involve a courtroom. Standing on the balcony of his suite at the Hotel Adlon in Berlin, he dangled the infant Blanket over the railing, 4 stories above the street, while a crowd below screamed and cameras flashed. And the image circled the globe within hours, and Jackson later called it a terrible mistake, and obviously it was. But it was also a window into something the public was only beginning to reckon with. That the most famous man in the world was not functioning normally, that his judgment was eroding, and that whatever private reality he inhibited was drifting further and further from the one the rest of the world shared. So by the early 2000s, Michael Jackson was a father of 3, a 2-time divorcee, the owner of the most valuable music catalog in the world, and a man whose body was quietly failing, ravaged by vitiligo, lupus, surgical procedures, chronic insomnia, and a pharmaceutical dependency that no intervention had permanently resolved. And he was 44 years old. And he was still, by any measure, the most famous person alive. And the worst was yet to come. So in May of 1992, a woman named June Chandler and her 13-year-old son Jordan were stranded on the side of the road in Los Angeles. Their car had broken down and they'd called Rent-A-Wreck for a replacement. And when it arrived, the employee who helped them recognized a name on the paperwork. One of their contacts was someone who worked with Michael Jackson. And throughout that thin thread of connection, June Chandler mentioned the encounter to the right person, who mentioned it to someone else, and within weeks, the Chandler family had entered Michael Jackson's orbit. Now, Jackson took to Jordan, or Jordy, as the family called him, with an intensity that was, by then, recognizable to people around him. And he had a pattern of forming deeply close relationships with children, particularly boys around the age of 12 or 13. And he would call them constantly, invite them to Neverland, shower them and their families with gifts and access to his world. And he was generous to a degree that seemed almost compulsive. And to Jackson, these relationships were innocent, an attempt to experience the childhood he believed had been stolen from him, to live inside the uncomplicated joy of a child's companionship. But to observers, they were at best unusual and at worst alarming. And the distance between those two interpretations would define the rest of Jackson's life. Now, Jordan Chandler's father was Evan Chandler, a Beverly Hills dentist who also worked as a screenwriter with a co-writing credit on Mel Brooks' Robin Hood, Men in Tights. And Evan was not part of the initial connection, because June had primary custody, and it was through her that Jackson and Jordan spent increasing amounts of time together. But Evan Chandler grew suspicious of the relationship, then angry, then something harder to categorize. So on July 8th, 1993, Evan Chandler was recorded in a phone conversation saying, quote,
"If I go through with this, I win big time. I will get everything I want, and they will be destroyed forever."
And the statement would become one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the case, because to Jackson defenders, it was proof that the allegations were financially motivated from the start, a shakedown dressed as child protection. And to those who believed the accusations, it was a father's anguished calculation about the legal system's leverage, not evidence that the underlying claims were false. Both readings are sustainable, but neither are definitive. And on August 17th, 1993, the allegations were formally reported to authorities, and Jordan Chandler described acts of SA by Jackson. And the Los Angeles Police Department and the Department of Children and Family Services opened investigations. And the story detonated across the global media with a force that made every previous Jackson tabloid saga look quaint. And on December 20th, 1993, Jackson submitted a strip search, a body examination conducted by investigators seeking to determine whether Jordan Chandler's description of Jackson's anatomy matched reality. And Jackson described the experience as the most humiliating event of his life. And the results of the examination have been the subject of conflicting interpretations ever since. because Jackson's camp maintained the descriptions did not match, and the prosecution's position was more ambiguous. And 2 grand juries were convened, and one in Los Angeles, one in Santa Barbara. Over 13 months, more than 400 witnesses were interviewed, and neither grand jury returned an indictment. So without an indictment, there could be no criminal trial, and on January 25th, 1994, a civil settlement was reached. And the amount was approximately $23 million, and Jackson's insurance carrier paid the claim. And Jackson's legal team maintained, and Jackson himself would insist for the rest of his life, that the settlement was not an admission of guilt, but a strategic decision to end a situation that was destroying him personally and professionally at the recommendation of his attorneys and over his own objections. And his critics argued that innocent men don't pay $23 million. And his defenders countered that innocent men, who are the most famous person on earth and hemorrhaging millions of dollars per week in canceled deals and destroyed partnerships, sometimes do. And the settlement did not include a confidentiality clause preventing the Chandlers from cooperating with criminal authorities. And Jordan Chandler and his family chose not to pursue criminal charges, so the investigation was closed. And Evan Chandler died on November 5th, 2009, less than 5 months after Michael Jackson's death. That is a bit suspicious. Why would you do that? Seems like out of guilt, but what do I know? And at that point, he had been estranged from his son Jordan for years, and his death was reported quietly, a footnote in a larger story that had already moved on. So for nearly a decade after the settlement, Jackson lived under a cloud that never fully dissipated. And the allegations had not been proven, they had not been disproven either, and they existed in a permanent state of suspicion, following him into every room, coloring every interaction, inflecting every headline. And his record sales would decline, and his public image curdled, and the jokes became cruel and ubiquitous. And he retreated further into Neverland, further into isolation, and further into the company of children and the animals and amusement park rides that constituted his version of a normal life. And then, in February of 2003, a British journalist named Martin Bashir aired a documentary called Living with Michael Jackson. And Bashir had spent 8 months with Jackson, gaining extraordinary access to his daily life at Neverland. And the documentary included a scene in which Jackson held hands with a 13-year-old boy named Gavin Arvizo, a child cancer patient Jackson had befriended in 2000, and said, on camera,
"But is it really appropriate for a 44-year-old man to share a bedroom with a child who is not related to him at all?
That's a beautiful thing.
That's not a worrying thing?
Why should it be worrying?"
And he meant it innocently, but unfortunately, it did not land innocently. And the documentary was watched by an estimated 14.6 million viewers in the UK and 22 million in the US, and the reaction was immediate and devastating. And Gavin Arvizo's family subsequently alleged that Jackson had molested the boy. So on November 18th, 2003, approximately 70 sheriff's deputies raided Neverland Ranch. And 2 days later, on November 20th, Jackson turned himself in to Santa Barbara County authorities, and he was arrested, handcuffed, photographed, and released on $3 million bail. And the booking photo, his expression, somewhere between defiance and dissociation, was broadcast on every television screen in the world. And he later said the arrest was deliberately humiliating, that he was handcuffed so tightly his wrists bled, that he was locked in a restroom smeared with feces, and that the officers laughed. And Santa Barbara authorities denied the claims fully. The truth of what happened in those hours between surrender and release has never been independently established, but the charges were severe. And in December of 2003, the initial indictment included 7 counts of child molestation, 2 counts of administering an intoxicating agent to a minor, and 1 count of conspiracy. But by April 2004, the indictment had been restructured. 4 counts of minor, 4 counts of intoxicating a minor with alcohol, and 1 count of attempted and 1 count of conspiracy, and 10 charges that would expand to 14 at verdict when lesser included offenses were added. So if convicted on all counts, Jackson faced decades in prison. So the trial, People versus Jackson, began with jury selection on January 31st, 2005 in Santa Maria, California, before Judge Rodney Melville. And opening arguments commenced on February 28th, and the prosecution, led by District Attorney Tom Sneddon, who had investigated Jackson during the 1993 case as well, and whose pursuit of Jackson struck many observers as personal. And he presented its case over several months. And approximately 140 witnesses were called, and the defense dismantled the prosecution's case methodically, with Gavin Arvizo's mother, Janet, was shown to have a history of making false claims, including welfare fraud and a prior false accusation of S against a JCPenney security guard. And the timeline of the alleged abuse was problematic, and the prosecution claimed this abuse occurred after the Bashir documentary aired, meaning Jackson had supposedly chosen to abuse the child immediately after the entire world had been put on alert about his relationships with children. And the family had continued to voluntarily visit Neverland and accept Jackson's hospitality throughout the period in question, which was odd. And Macaulay Culkin, the former child star of Home Alone, who had been one of Jackson's closest childhood companions and who the prosecution hoped to establish as a prior victim, took the stand and testified unequivocally that he had never been abused by Jackson. And Wade Robson, an Australian choreographer who had known Jackson since childhood, also testified that he had never been abused. But Robson would reverse his position in 2013, filing a civil claim alleging years of abuse. But on the witness stand in 2005, under oath, he said it never happened. And on June 13th, 2005, the jury returned its verdict, not guilty, on all 14 counts, and it was unanimous. And Jackson was in the courtroom when the verdicts were read, and he showed little visible emotion. And outside the courthouse, thousands of fans who had maintained a vigil throughout the trial erupted. And inside, according to people who were with him, Jackson was hollowed out. And the acquittal was total, the vindication was complete, but it didn't matter. The trial had consumed nearly 2 years of his life, cost tens of millions of dollars, and left him physically and psychologically destroyed. And he had entered the courtroom weighing, by some accounts, less than 120 pounds because he had been unable to eat. And he had been unable to sleep, or rather, he had been unable to sleep without propofol, and the demands of daily court appearances had disrupted even that pharmaceutical oblivion. So after the verdict, Michael Jackson left the courthouse, left Santa Maria, and effectively left the United States. And he would spend most of the next 2.5 years abroad, in Bahrain, in Ireland, in various rented properties scattered across the world. A man acquitted of everything and unable to return to normal life. And Neverland, the place he had built as a sanctuary, had been raided and violated and publicized in every tabloid on Earth. So he felt like he couldn't go back, and he would never live there again. And the allegations from 1993 and 2005, the settlement and the acquittal, became the defining lens through which Michael Jackson would be viewed for the rest of his life and beyond. Not the music, not the dancing, not the record sales or the moonwalk or the transformation of pop culture. The question, the unresolvable, unanswerable, permanent question that followed him out of the courtroom, across the ocean, into exile, and it was still following him 3.5 years later, in the summer of 2009, when he agreed to perform 50 concerts in London and began rehearsing for a comeback he would not survive. So after the acquittal, Michael Jackson did what any person might do if they had been publicly accused of the worst crimes imaginable, dragged through a 5-month trial, broadcast to the world, and found not guilty on every count. He ran. And in June 2005, Jackson left the United States for Bahrain, a small island kingdom in the Persian Gulf, the personal guest of Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamad bin Aya Al Khalifa, a son of the king. That was a mouthful. And the Sheikh provided Jackson with a residence, staff, security, and a loan of $2.2 million to cover outstanding legal fees from the trial. And the arrangement was, for a time, a genuine refuge, and he stayed nearly a year from June 2005 to May 2006, before the relationship with the Sheikh kind of soured. And Abdullah later sued Jackson for approximately $4.7 million, claiming Jackson had failed to honor commitments related to a planned album and autobiography. And after Bahrain, Jackson drifted to Ireland for several months, then to various rented properties in the United States and Europe. But he was a man without a fixed address, without a clear plan, and without financial stability. And by this point, Jackson's debt had reached approximately $500 million. That number is almost incomprehensible until you understand its architecture. Because decades of lavish spending on Neverland's upkeep, the zoo, the staff, the constant travel, the legal defense costs from 2 sets of allegations, the entourage, the mansions, the shopping, all layered on top of hundreds of millions borrowed against his share of the Sony ATV catalog at punishing interest rates. He was one of the wealthiest people alive on paper and functionally insolvent in practice. And the catalog, worth billions, was also his only lifeline, the collateral that kept the creditors at bay. And if the loans defaulted, he could lose everything. So it was into this desperation that the concert deal arrived. And in late 2008, a mysterious figure entered Jackson's life. Or rather, re-entered it. And that was Tomei. Now, Tomei, a man with a deliberately obscured background who represented himself variously as a doctor and orthopedic surgeon, a PhD in economics, and an ambassador at large for Senegal, none of which was true, had been introduced to Jackson through Germain. Now, Tomei, working as a consultant for Colony Capital, connected Jackson to Colony's chairman. And Tom Barrick, who connected him to Philip Anschutz, the billionaire owner of AEG Live, the world's second largest concert promoter. A deal began to take shape. And on March 5th, 2009, Jackson appeared at the O2 Arena in London to make the announcement. And between 3,000 and 7,000 fans were waiting, and accounts vary, with AEG's own CEO, Randy Phillips, testifying under oath to the lower number. And 350 journalists had been credentialed, and Jackson arrived 90 minutes late. And when he finally took stage, he looked thin, he looked fragile, and he told the crowd this would be it, the final curtain call. This is it. And he said,
"This is it. This is really it. This is the final curtain call."
And the name stuck, and the concerts would be held at the O2 Arena starting that July, and Jackson had agreed to 10 shows. And within days, AEG expanded the commitment to 50. Roughly 750,000 tickets were sold, generating approximately $85 million in revenue before a single note was performed. And AEG had advanced Jackson close to $30 million in production costs, loans, and living expenses, including $100,000 per month for a mansion in Holmby Hills and a $15 million line of credit. The financial exposure was enormous for both sides. And for AEG, a successful run could generate hundreds of millions, and a global tour beyond London was projected at $450 million or more, and for Jackson, the concerts represented a path out of debt, or, if he couldn't perform, total financial annihilation. Behind the scenes, things were going badly from the start. As Randy Phillips, AEG's CEO, sent an email before the March 5th announcement describing Jackson as locked in his room drunk and despondent. And Phillips later testified that he had screamed at Jackson to get him out of the room and had slapped him on the butt to motivate him. And Phillips and Jackson's manager, Frank Delio, had to physically help dress him. And the man who walked on stage and told the world he was ready for his comeback had to be coerced into putting on his clothes. And the rehearsals began in the spring of 2009 at the Staples Center and the Forum in Inglewood. And on good days, Jackson was brilliant. Dancers and musicians who worked with him during this period described flashes of the old magic, moments where his movement and vocal power were fully intact, where you could see the greatest performer of his generation still living inside the increasingly fragile body. And on bad days, he was incoherent. He was cold when the room was warm. He trembled. He couldn't remember choreography he had performed thousands of times, and he was losing weight constantly. And he was not sleeping. And on June 19th, 2009, 6 days before his death, the show's director, Kenny Ortega, sent an email to Randy Phillips with the subject line, "Trouble at the Front." And Ortega described finding Jackson, quote-unquote, lost and incoherent at rehearsal, cold to touch, trembling, unable to perform. And he had wrapped Jackson in blankets and tried to feed him. Quote, "There are strong signs of paranoia, anxiety, and obsessive-like behavior," unquote, Ortega would write. And quote, "I think the very best thing we can do is get a top psychiatrist in to evaluate him ASAP," unquote. So Alif Sankey, an associate producer on the show, was more blunt, saying, quote-unquote, "Michael is dying," she told colleagues. And quote-unquote, "He needs to be put in a hospital." And Phillips' response shut Ortega down, saying, quote, "It is critical that neither you, me, or anyone become amateur psychiatrists or physicians," unquote, he would write. And Phillips described Jackson's personal physician, a cardiologist named Conrad Murray, as, quote-unquote, "extremely successful and totally unbiased and ethical." And he instructed Ortega to defer to Murray's medical judgment. So Dr. Conrad Murray, born February 19th, 1953 in Granada, board eligible but not board certified in cardiology, internal medicine certification lapsed, and no training in anesthesiology, sleep medicine, or pain management, over $4,000 in court judgments, a 2002 bankruptcy, defaulted on his $1.66 million mortgage, child support arrears for children by multiple women, a Las Vegas clinic facing eviction, was about to treat Michael Jackson. Now, he had first met Michael Jackson in December of 2006 through Jackson's children. And by 2009, Jackson had requested that Murray serve as his personal physician for the London concerts. And AEG agreed to pay Murray $150,000 per month, a salary Murray had negotiated down from his initial ask of $5 million per year. He's not even qualified. And the contract contained a provision that gave AEG the power to terminate the agreement if concerts were postponed or canceled, creating what experts would later describe as an egregious conflict of interest. The doctor's income depended on the patient performing. Very bad, and already a unqualified, greedy bastard is now treating Michael Jackson. It's just a nightmare that is about to unfold. But no background check was conducted. An unemployment expert later testified that a $10 search would have revealed Murray's financial desperation, and Murray was administering propofol to Jackson nightly in a bedroom, not a hospital, and he had no pulse oximeter monitoring Jackson's oxygen levels, and he had no capnography equipment to measure exhaled carbon dioxide either, and the oxygen tank in the room was empty, and the pulse oximeter was still in its box unopened. But he was putting a man under general anesthesia every night with no monitoring equipment and no emergency protocols in a rented mansion in Holmby Hills so that the most famous entertainer in history could approximate something that resembled sleep. Absolutely abhorrent. So on the evening of June 24th, 2009, Michael Jackson arrived at the Staples Center for what would be his final rehearsal. And he got there around 6:30 p.m. and worked until approximately 12:30 a.m. on June 25th. And footage from that night, later released as part of the This Is It documentary, shows Jackson performing Earth Song with full commitment, hitting his marks, directing the band. It was one of the good nights. And those who saw him said he looked like Michael Jackson again. And his personal chef, Kai Chase, prepared his dinner, and Jackson ate, then retired to his bedroom on the second floor of Holmby Hills mansion at 100 North Carrollwood Drive. And Dr. Conrad Murphy was with him. And what happened in that bedroom over the next 14 hours is known primarily through Murray's own account, given to police, contested by prosecutors, and never subjected to cross-examination because Murray chose not to testify at either his criminal trial or the AEG wrongful death trial. And according to Murray, Jackson was agitated and unable to sleep. So Murray began administering a sequence of sedatives, escalating through the night as each one failed to produce unconsciousness. So at 1:30 a.m., 10 milligrams of diazepam or Valium intravenously. And at 2 a.m., 2 milligrams of lorazepam or Ativan administered intravenously. And at 3 a.m., 2 milligrams of midazolam or Versed administered intravenously. And at 5 a.m., 2 milligrams of lorazepam again. And at 7:30 a.m., 2 milligrams of midazolam again. But none of it worked. And for 6 hours, Murray pumped Jackson full of benzodiazepines, and Jackson remained awake. His body so conditioned to sedation, so profoundly broken in its ability to achieve natural sleep, that clinical doses of multiple tranquilizers could not bring him down. And according to Murray, Jackson begged for propofol throughout the night, and Murray claimed he resisted. And he claimed he was trying to wean Jackson off the drug. And at approximately 10:40 a.m., Murray administered 25 milligrams of propofol, a dose he described as small, diluted in a lidocaine drip. And by about 10:50 a.m., Jackson was unconscious. And Murray said he then monitored Jackson for approximately 10 minutes. And around 11 a.m., he left the room for about 2 minutes, he claimed. And when he returned, Michael Jackson was not breathing. But the phone records tell a different story about those minutes. Because beginning at 11:18 a.m., Murray made 3 phone calls. A 32-minute call to his Las Vegas office, a 3-minute call to a patient, and an 11-minute call to a Houston colleague. So 47 minutes on the phone. During this time, by his account, his patient was unconscious under propofol with no monitoring equipment. And what happened between approximately 11 a.m. and 12:17 p.m. when bodyguard Alberto Alvarez arrived at the bedroom and found Murray performing what appeared to be CPR on the bed is a gap that has never been fully explained. And Alvarez later testified that when he entered the room, Murray was frantic. And according to Alvarez, Murray grabbed vials from a nightstand and ordered Alvarez to put them in a bag. And Murray then had Alvarez remove an IV bag containing a milky white substance, the color of propofol. And only after these items were concealed, Alvarez testified, did Murray direct him to call 911. And it should be noted that Alvarez made no mention of the vial concealing in his first police interview on June 25th. The account emerged on August 31st after Jackson's cause of death had been made public. And the 911 call was placed at 12:21 p.m., and Alvarez told the dispatcher that a 50-year-old man, he said 50, Jackson was in fact 50, had stopped breathing.
We have a gentleman here that needs help, and he's not breathing yet. He's not breathing, and we're trying to pump him, but he's not breathing. So.
And the dispatcher asked if the patient was on a bed, and he was, and the dispatcher told them to move him to the floor for CPR, and this had not been done. And Murray had been performing chest compressions on a mattress, which he should know if he's a doctor, absorbs the force and renders CPR largely ineffective. And paramedics arrived at 12:26 p.m., and they found Jackson on the bed, and he had been moved to the floor briefly, then returned with an IV in his left leg. His body cool to the touch and his pupils fixed and dilated. And paramedic Richard Seneff estimated based on Jackson's condition that at least 20 minutes had elapsed since cardiac arrest, because Michael Jackson's extremities were beginning to turn blue. And Murray did not tell the paramedics that he had administered propofol, and he did not tell the emergency room doctors at UCLA Medical Center either. And he would never voluntarily disclose the propofol. And the paramedics worked on Jackson at the house and then during transport, and the ambulance left the Carrollwood mansion at 1:07 p.m. and arrived at UCLA Ronald Reagan Medical Center at approximately 1:14 p.m. And emergency physicians continued resuscitation efforts for over an hour. And at 2:26 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time on June 25th, 2009, Michael Joseph Jackson was pronounced dead. He was 50 years old. And at 2:44 p.m., 18 minutes after the pronouncement, TMZ published the news. And the story broke not through a hospital statement or family announcement or a press conference, but through a celebrity gossip website, because that was the world Michael Jackson had lived and died in. And within minutes, the internet buckled, and Google servers registered such a massive spike in search traffic that the company's automated systems interpreted it as a distributed denial of service attack. And Twitter crashed, and Wikipedia crashed, and 15% of all Twitter posts in the hour that followed mentioned Michael Jackson. The servers couldn't hold the grief. And I, like I'm sure many, remember this day, and it is cemented in my brain. What a horribly tragic day. So the Los Angeles County Coroner's autopsy performed the following day established the cause of death as acute propofol intoxication with a contributory benzodiazepine effect, meaning the propofol killed him, and the cascade of sedatives Murray had administered throughout the night made the lethal dose more lethal. And the manner of death was ruled a homicide. And the autopsy revealed a body that told the story of its occupant's life. Jackson stood 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 136 pounds. His skin showed the depigmentation pattern of vitiligo, confirming the diagnosis he had disclosed 16 years earlier on Oprah's couch. The condition the tabloids had spent decades insisting was voluntary skin bleaching. His heart was healthy, his major organs were functional. There was no cancer, no terminal illness, no underlying condition that would have killed him. Without the propofol, Michael Jackson's body could have continued living. It was not the body that failed, it was the people around his body. So Conrad Murray was charged with involuntary manslaughter on February 8th, 2010, 8 months after Jackson's death. Not murder. Not even second-degree murder, which the LAPD detectives who investigated the case believed the evidence warranted. Lead detectives Orlando Martinez, Dan Myers, and Scott Smith would later state in a 2019 documentary called Killing Michael Jackson that they had pushed for a second-degree murder charge, but the district attorney's office opted for manslaughter. And the trial lasted 6 weeks from September 27th to November 7th, 2011. And the prosecution's case was straightforward. Murray had administered a powerful surgical anesthetic in a home setting without appropriate monitoring equipment, had failed to call 911 promptly, had attempted to conceal evidence, and had never disclosed the propofol to emergency medical personnel. And the defense argued that Jackson had self-administered additional propofol when Murray left the room, an accidental overdose by a desperate addict, not criminal negligence by a doctor. Doctor. Not a doctor at all. And Murray did not take the stand. And on November 7th, 2011, the jury found Conrad Murray guilty of involuntary manslaughter, and he was sentenced on November 29th to 4 years in county jail. 4 years. That was the maximum for the charge. And due to California's overcrowding provisions, he served approximately 2 years before being released on October 28th, 2013. And he later published a memoir titled This Is It, positioning himself as a scapegoat, and he never expressed remorse for Jackson's death, even though it was completely his fault. And then the second trial was civil. Catherine Jackson, Michael's mother, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against AEG Live, seeking between $1.5 and $2 billion in damages. In the case, Catherine Jackson versus AEG Live was the longer and in many ways more revealing proceeding, lasting 5 months with 58 witnesses. And the central question was whether AEG had hired, controlled, or supervised Murray, and whether they bore responsibility for placing a financially desperate, unqualified doctor in charge of Jackson's care. And the evidence that emerged was damning in texture, if not in legal outcome. And AEG's own emails showed executives who knew Jackson was deteriorating and pushed forward anyway. And Paul Gongware, AEG's co-CEO, had written of Murray, quote, "We want to remind him that it is AEG, not Michael Jackson, who is paying his salary. We want him to understand what is expected of him," unquote. No background check had been conducted. The contract gave AEG termination power over Murray's compensation if shows were postponed, meaning the doctor's paycheck depended on his patient performing, as we said before. And Kenny Ortega's trouble at the front email describing Jackson as lost and incoherent 6 days before his death had been answered with Phillips' instructions to stop playing amateur doctor and defer to to Murray. And Prince Jackson, Michael's eldest son, 15 years old at the time, testified that his father had told him in tears after phone calls with AEG executives, quote unquote, "They're going to kill me. They're going to kill me." And he named Randy Phillips and Tomei specifically. And on October 2nd, 2013, the jury delivered its verdict. And they found unanimously that AEG Live had indeed hired Conrad Murray. But they also found that Murray was not unfit or incompetent for the job, a conclusion that struck many observers as difficult to reconcile with the facts. Because the jury answered no to the competence question, AEG was found not liable, and the case was over. And the jury foreman later told reporters, quote, "Had the question been, was Murray ethical? It could have been a different outcome," unquote. Just unbelievable, in my opinion. And Katherine Jackson's appeal was rejected by the California Court of Appeals in 2015. And after Jackson's death, Randy Phillips wrote in an email, quote, "AEG will make a fortune from merch sales, ticket retention, the touring exhibition, and the film/DVD," unquote. And unfortunately, he was right. AEG recouped its losses and then some through merchandise, through the 40 to 50% of ticket holders who kept their tickets as souvenirs rather than requesting refunds, and through a 10% stake in This Is It, the concert rehearsal documentary assembled from footage of Jackson's final rehearsals. And the film grossed $267 million worldwide. And it showed Michael Jackson dancing, singing, directing, alive, electric, unmistakably brilliant. The last footage of the greatest performer who ever lived, packaged and sold to the world by the company his son said was going to kill him. So the Los Angeles County coroner ruled the manner of Michael Jackson's death as a homicide, as we know. And Conrad Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, a charge that led the LAPD detectives on the case believed should have been second-degree murder. And the official cause was acute propofol intoxication administered by a doctor who should have never been in that bedroom. So for the legal system, the story ends there. But for Jackson's family and for a substantial number of people who have examined the documented evidence, including myself, it does not. And Michael Jackson spent the last years of his life telling the people closest to him that he was going to be killed. And his son, Prince, who testified under oath at the AEG trial in 2013, quote, "After he got off the phone, he would cry. He would say, 'They're going to kill me, they're going to kill me,' unquote." And he named specific people, AEG's Randy Phillips and his former manager, Tomei. And he told Lisa Marie Presley during one of their final conversations in 2005 that someone was going to kill him for his music catalog. And she confirmed on Oprah in 2010 that he gave her names. But as we said before, she declined to share them. And he told his sister, LaToya, quote, "I'm going to be murdered for my music publishing catalog and my estate," unquote.
You've been quoted as saying you believe it may have been murdered. Do you still think that?
Absolutely.
Why?
Absolutely.
Why are you so sure?
I would never, ever think differently.
And he told his daughter Paris, who recalled in a 2017 Rolling Stones interview, quote, "He would drop hints about people out to get him. And at some point he was like, 'They're going to kill me one day,' unquote." And handwritten notes attributed to Jackson, shared by a friend and published in 2017, read, quote, "They are trying to murder me, and the system wants to kill me for my catalog," unquote. And his bodyguards, Bill Whitfield and Havon Beard, wrote in their 2014 memoir that Jackson's primary security concern was not fans or strangers, but, quote, "the people who were already in his life. He wanted us there so he could hide his movements from his own lawyers and managers," unquote. And the identity of they shifted over time, and AEG executives, Sony, Tommy Mottola, unnamed catalog seekers, the system. And the warnings were consistent, and the question is what they mean. Prophetic awareness of a genuine conspiracy, or the escalating paranoia of a man whose brain was being ravaged by nightly propofol and regular Demerol injections, substances known to exacerbate anxiety and disordered thinking. And the honest answer is that both could be true simultaneously. And what follows are the major theories presented with the evidence that supports them and the evidence that complicates them. And I want to put a disclaimer that none of these have been proven, but also that none can be entirely dismissed. And the broadest and most legally tested theory holds that AEG Live knowingly pushed a deteriorating Jackson beyond his limits to protect a roughly $30 million investment while hiring a financially desperate doctor they could control. The evidence is substantial because AEG expanded Jackson's commitment from 10 shows to 50 within days of the announcement, despite handwritten notes attributed to Jackson reading, quote, only agreed to 10 shows, unquote. And their own CEO described Jackson as, quote, locked in his room, drunk and despondent, unquote, before the press conference. And their co-CEO wrote of Murray, quote, we want to remind him that it is AEG, not Michael Jackson, who is paying his salary, unquote. And when Kenny Ortega warned 6 days before Jackson's death that the performer was lost and incoherent and needed a psychiatrist, Randy Phillips told him to stop playing amateur doctor. No background check was conducted on Murray. The contract tied Murray's compensation to the concert's proceedings, and so on. We know this. We know all the information regarding the AEG theory. But after the trial, the jury, while unanimously finding that AEG had hired Murray, concluded he was not unfit or incompetent, and therefore AEG bore no liability. But the counter-argument is real. A living Jackson touring globally over 3 years was projected to generate $450 million or more. And AEG also dropped its own $17.5 million of insurance claim with Lloyd's of London in 2012. Not exactly the behavior of a company that planned a death for profit. I personally think, and you guys can sound off all of what you think in the comments, but I feel like it was in their interest to have Michael actually do those concerts. Did they use him horrifically, and did that lead to his death? Absolutely. But I don't think that was planned. But they were absolutely a giant part of him passing away. And next there is the catalog theory. And this is the theory Jackson himself most explicitly articulated, because his 50% stake in the Sony ATV catalog, purchased in 1985 for $47.5 million, worth approximately $1 billion by 2009 and $4 billion by 2016, made him one of the most valuable targets in the entertainment industry. And he had publicly declared war on Sony in July 2002, calling CEO Tommy Mottola a racist and very, very devilish at Al Sharpton's National Action Network in Harlem. And he accused Sony of sabotaging his album Invincible to force a catalog sale. And by 2009, Jackson had borrowed between $270 and $380 million against his catalog share, held by Fortress Investment Group at 16.8% annual interest, because a default could trigger a forced sale. And Sony held a first right of refusal. So what happened after his death is the theory's most powerful exhibit. So in 2016, Sony bought the estate's 50% of Sony ATV for $750 million. And in 2018, Sony paid $287.5 million for the estate's share of EMI Music Publishing. And in 2024, Sony purchased 50% of Jackson's Vizak music catalog for over $600 million. Total payments from Sony to the estate now exceed $2 billion. So Sony owns the catalog Jackson swore he would never sell. That's the basis of all of this. So that doesn't look good. Looks like they were constantly waiting to prey upon this sale. But the counter argument would be that Sony could have acquired the catalog through legal financial pressure. And Jackson's mounting debt had a forced sale plausible without violence. And no law enforcement investigation found evidence of a catalog-motivated conspiracy, and Murray's conviction established propofol negligence, not corporate assassination. Now, a narrower version of the conspiracy asks not whether Jackson was murdered by a corporation or a cabal, but whether Murray was specifically selected or allowed to remain because his financial desperation made him controllable and his lack of qualifications made Jackson's death inevitable. Now, to go over Murray again, he owed over $1 million. He had defaulted on a $1.66 million mortgage, and he had $600,000 in court judgments, and he had $71,000 in student loans, child support for children by 6 or 7 women, and a 2002 bankruptcy. and his Las Vegas clinic was being evicted. And he initially asked, as we know, AEG for $5 million per year before accepting $150,000 per month. And LAPD Detective Orlando Martinez testified that Murray's financial situation was a major incentive to break the rules. And his qualifications were grossly inadequate for what he was doing, not board certified in cardiology, internal medicine certification lapsed, no training in anesthesiology or sleep medicine, suspended from hospitals 3 times, and he administered propofol nightly in a bedroom with no pulse oximeter, no capnography, and an empty oxygen tank. And the timeline on June 25th raises its own questions. 47 minutes of phone calls while his patient lay unconscious, a gap of over an hour before 911 was called, and bodyguard testimony about concealing vials before summoning help. Murray never told paramedics or emergency physicians that he had administered propofol. And Paris Jackson was direct, saying, quote, "Absolutely, because it's obvious, all arrows point to that," unquote. And she used air quotes around the word doctor when discussing Murray, which, yeah. And the LAPD detectives who built the case believed the evidence warranted a second-degree murder charge. But, as we're doing for all the other theories, there's the counter-argument. And that is that Murray, the idiot that he is, panicked, had a chaotic response that looked more like incompetence than execution, and if he had been hired to kill, the execution would presumably have been more professional. And Jackson actively sought propofol. Multiple doctors before Murray had refused his requests. So, I don't know. I would love to know what you guys think down below. And the next one is that Jackson was approximately $500 million in debt at the time of his death. And his estate has since generated roughly $3.5 billion. And Joe Jackson said it publicly, saying, quote, "He's worth more dead than he was alive," unquote. And the IRS argued the same point during tax proceedings. And Forbes named Jackson the top earning dead celebrity in nearly every year since 2009, peaking at $825 million in 2016. And the This Is It documentary grossed $267 million, and the Cirque du Soleil residency generated over $160 million, and the Broadway musical grossed approximately $300 million, and the estate cleared all $500 million in debt and is currently valued at $2 to $2.5 billion. And the counter-argument is just timing, because this success was not foreseeable in 2009. And a living Jackson completing a 3-year global tour was the most immediately profitable scenario for everyone involved. And the worth more dead than alive observation is retrospective, powerful as rhetoric, but weak as evidence of any premeditation. And then there's Dr. Arnold Klein. Now, Dr. Arnold Klein, Jackson's longtime Beverly Hills dermatologist, administered over 200 Demerol injections across decades, with records kept under the alias Omar Arnold. And in the 4 months before Jackson's death, the doses escalated dramatically, 375 milligrams in 3 hours on April 22, 2009, and 900 milligrams over 3 days in May. And his last appointment was June 22nd, 3 days before death. And when he received 100 milligrams, a typical anxiety dose is 50 milligrams, just so you know. Murray's defense argued the chain explicitly, that Klein's Demerol created dependency, withdrawal caused insomnia, insomnia drove propofol use, and propofol killed him. And Demerol's short half-life meant none appeared in the autopsy, but withdrawal symptoms from the June 22nd injection would have been active on June 25th. So Klein was investigated by the DEA and the California Medical Board, but never charged. And he filed for bankruptcy in 2011 and died in 2015 at the age of 70. And the mainstream interpretation is that Klein was an enabler in a system of medical exploitation, not a conspirator, but a link in the chain that killed Michael Jackson nonetheless. And now the most enigmatic figure in Jackson's final years was his manager, Tomei, a man who represented himself as a Lebanese doctor, orthopedic surgeon, PhD in economics, and ambassador at large for Senegal. But under cross-examination at an IRS tax trial, he admitted he had never attended medical school and did not hold a PhD. And the Senegalese embassy confirmed he was not their ambassador. So Tomei entered Jackson's life in late 2007 through Jermaine Jackson, working as a consultant for Colony Capital at $20,000 per month. And he connected Jackson to Colony's Tom Barrack, who connected him to AEG's Philip Anschutz. And Tomei negotiated the "this is it" deal, and his financial arrangements were extraordinarily favorable. A $35,000 monthly management fee, 15% commission on all Jackson's earnings, which is crazy, and $100,000 per month as a concert producer, and a $2.3 million finder's fee for a Neverland loan, and 10% of any future Neverland sale. But Jackson fired Tomei on May 5th, 2009, 7 weeks before his death. And Tomei reportedly responded with rage, threatening to bring death and destruction on Michael Jackson. But despite being fired, Tomei denied his termination, continued identifying himself as Jackson's manager, and on the day of Jackson's death, spoke as his representative at UCLA Medical Center. Just a scum-of-the-earth piece of shit. And a taped conversation from September 2008 captures Jackson's own unease, saying, quote, "This guy has ways about him. There's a divide between me and my representatives, and I don't talk to my lawyer, my accountant," unquote. And Prince Jackson named Tomei by name in his sworn testimony. And the estate later sued Tomei for financial exploitation, and the case settled in 2019 for $3 million. And the counter-argument is basically that Tomei was not at that mansion on June 25th. And there is no actual tangible evidence that connects him to the Propofol administration and a lawsuit alleged financial exploitation, not necessarily murder. And beyond the major theories lie smaller, less substantiated claims. 5 of the Jackson siblings alleged in 2012 that his July 7th, 2002 will was forged, claiming he was in New York City at an Al Sharpton event on the date it was supposedly signed in Los Angeles. And the legal challenges were rejected by every court that heard them, and from LA Supreme Court through the California Supreme Court. Jackson's entertainment attorney Peter Lopez was found dead from a gunshot wound on April 30th, 2010, less than a year after Jackson's death, ruled an apparent you-know-what. And conspiracy theorists noted a cluster of connected deaths in the months after Jackson's. Evan Chandler had died by you-know-what in November of 2009, and Bruce Ayers, a former Klein employee, in December of 2009, and Lopez. And Canadian journalist Ian Halperin predicted in December of 2008, 6 months before the death, that Jackson had 6 months to live. And his conclusion was, quote, "Greed killed Michael Jackson," unquote. But no court and no law enforcement investigation and no credible journalistic inquiry has established that Michael Jackson was deliberately murdered as part of a conspiracy. And the official cause of death is acute propofol intoxication due to criminally negligent care by a doctor who was convicted and served 2 years, which is garbage in my opinion. And a 5-month civil trial found AEG not liable, yet the documented record provides substantial material for those who believe the story is incomplete. And Jackson repeatedly warned he would be killed, naming specific individuals in his son's sworn testimony, but the coroner ruled the manner of death a homicide. And Katherine Jackson would say in 2011, quote, "If such evidence ever comes to my attention, I will be the first to bring those facts to light," unquote. But the evidence still has not arrived, but the questions have not gone away. And on July 7th of 2009, 12 days after his death, Michael Jackson was memorialized at the Staples Center in Los Angeles, and 17,500 tickets were distributed by lottery from a pool of over 1 million applicants. And an estimated 2.5 billion people watched globally, though that figure is essentially unverifiable. And Stevie Wonder performed, and Mariah Carey performed, and Usher approached the open casket and broke down. And Jennifer Hudson sang, "Will You Be There?" And Smokey Robinson read from the Bible, and Brooke Shields, one of Jackson's closest friends, described the boy she had known since they were both teenagers, 2 of the most famous children in the world, finding refuge in each other's company. And Berry Gordy, the man who had signed the Jackson 5 4 decades earlier, called him the greatest entertainer that ever lived. And Reverend Al Sharpton addressed Jackson's 3 children directly.
Wasn't nothing strange about your daddy. It was strange what your daddy had to deal with.
And the moment that silenced the arena came at the end, with Paris Jackson, 11 years old, stepped to the microphone.
Ever since I was born, Daddy has been the best father you could ever imagine. And I just wanted to say I love him so much.
And she could not finish, so Janet Jackson held her. And Michael Jackson would then be buried on September 3rd, 2009 at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, interred in the Holly Terrace section of the Great Mausoleum. So he would forever be remembered as the greatest performer who ever lived. But those questions are still being asked to this day, mostly in why did he actually die? Because it's hard to even accept what came to be. And for a while, it seemed like the story might end there, with the gold casket, the tearful daughter, the billion-dollar estate slowly paying off a dead man's debts. The world moved on the way it always does. Jokes faded, and the music came back on the radio, and the conspiracy theories settled into the corners of the internet where conspiracy theories live. So it seemed Michael Jackson finally was being allowed to rest. Until a decade later. So a decade after Jackson's death, the allegations would return. And on January 25th, 2019, the documentary Leaving Neverland premiered at a Sundance Film Festival, directed by Dan Reed. And the 4-hour film featured two men, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, describing in graphic detail what they said were years of by Jackson during their childhoods. And Robson was the same choreographer who had testified under oath at Jackson's 2005 criminal trial that he had never been abused. And he reversed his position in 2013, filing a civil claim against the estate. And Safechuck filed a similar claim. And the documentary was devastating in its impact. And it won a Primetime Emmy Award, and radio stations pulled Jackson's music from rotation. And The Simpsons removed an episode featuring his voice, and statues were taken down, and the cultural reassessment was swift and severe. And the Jackson estate responded with a $100 million lawsuit against HBO, alleging the network had violated a non-disparagement clause from a 1992 concert film agreement. And the legal battle over the Robson and Safechuck claims continues, and a trial is actually scheduled for November 2026. And the estate has denied all allegations and has pointed to Robson's prior sworn testimony, inconsistencies in the accuser's timelines, and the 2005 jury's unanimous acquittal. And the documentary did not settle the question that has followed Michael Jackson since 1993. It just deepened it. And then, just as the world thought it had heard everything there was to hear about Michael Jackson, just as the debate between defenders and accusers had calcified into two immovable camps, a dead man's filing cabinet blew the conversation wide open again. And in January 2024, and again in December of 2025, and again in January of 2026, the U.S. Department of Justice released millions of pages of documents, images, and videos related to Jeffrey Epstein, whom I have spoken about at length on this channel. And Michael Jackson's name appeared in the files. And for a man who had spent the last 16 years of his life under suspicion involving children and who had been fully acquitted, the mere appearance of his name in Epstein records detonated across social media with predictable ferocity and minimal context. And the actual content of the files tells a narrow story. And the key testimony comes from Joanna Joberg, an Epstein victim, who stated in a 2016 deposition that she met Michael Jackson at Epstein's house in Palm Beach. And when lawyers asked whether she had given Michael Jackson a massage, standard questioning since massages were a known euphemism in Epstein's operation, Joberg's answer was unequivocal: "I did not." And no allegation of inappropriate conduct by Jackson appears anywhere in the files. No victim has accused him of anything. And on December 19th, 2025, the DOJ released over 300,000 pages of documents, including previously unseen photographs, and 2 images involved Jackson. The first showed him posing with Epstein at the Palm Beach house, and Jackson in a suit and dark sunglasses, and Epstein casually dressed, standing in front of a painting. And the second showed Jackson with Bill Clinton and Diana Ross, with children's faces redacted. And that photo was taken at a Democratic National Committee fundraiser at the Apollo Theater in Harlem on April 24, 2002. And there was no record that Epstein was present at that event. And the image was simply found among Epstein's possessions. And White House Deputy Press Secretary Abigail Jackson was subsequently called out for inserting the Apollo photo into social media posts implying it depicted the trio with Epstein's victims. The children in the photo were Michael Jackson and Diana Ross's own children. And Matt Fides, Jackson's bodyguard for approximately a decade, provided immediate context for the Epstein photo. And he stated it was taken in 2003 during a week of house hunting in Palm Beach, and Jackson was considering a move to be closer to his friend Barry Gibb, with whom he was recording daily. And Epstein's residence was one of roughly 30 properties they toured with a real estate agent. And the encounter lasted no more than half a minute. A polite greeting and a photograph. Quote, "We never even knew who Epstein was," unquote, Fights writes, and quote, "He was not famous then," unquote. Connection to James Maiskin, a real estate figure arranging property viewings for Jackson, whose attorney had a link to Epstein's circle. And CBS News and other outlets noted that Epstein routinely collected photographs with celebrities to project social legitimacy, because we know he was a monster piece of shit who just needed to look famous all the time. But Michael Jackson's name does not appear in Epstein's contact book at all. And it does not appear in the flight logs of Epstein's private planes either. And there are no emails, letters, phone records, financial transactions, or any evidence of further contact between the two beyond that single house viewing encounter for half a minute. And as of February 2026, apart from Epstein himself, Ghislaine Maxwell and Jean-Luc Brunel, no individual has been charged with a crime connected to the Epstein files, as we know if you have watched this channel. And hundreds of public figures appear in the documents without any allegation of wrongdoing. But for Michael Jackson, the Epstein files are ultimately notable for what they do not contain. But the damage was already done, not by the files themselves, but by the headlines that outran them. So another cycle of suspicion and another wave of context arriving too late to catch the accusation. And it's the story of Michael Jackson's entire afterlife. The truth never moves as fast as the rumor. And yet, somehow, neither does the music. Because underneath all of it, the trials, the conspiracies, the files, the documentaries, the arguments that will outlive everyone reading this, there is still the work. And the work refuses to disappear. Michael Joseph Jackson was born on August 29, 1958, in a 672 square foot house in Gary, Indiana. He died on June 25, 2009, in a rented mansion in Los Angeles at the age of 50. And between those 2 points, he became the most famous person on the planet and one of the most complicated figures the American century ever produced. And the arguments about what he was and was done to him show no signs of ending. But the music, at least, is settled. And it is as close to permanent as anything human beings have made. And that is that for Michael Jackson. This was a long one. You guys have asked me to deep dive into multiple figures like Marilyn Monroe and Princess Diana and Michael Jackson. If you have anybody else you want me to deep dive into, let me know down below. I always read the comments. And until then, I will see your beautiful face. All right?